What if I told you you could have everything you ever wanted? You could have a life where you accomplish every dream you ever had. You are wealthy, you live in a big house, you are respected and admired not only because of your ideas, but because of the good you have done in the world. You are an innovator and philanthropist. Every day you get to wake up and only do what matters most to you. You take care of your family. Parents never have to work again. Siblings get to make fulfilling choices because you have freed them from base financial obligations. You are truly one of the most accomplished humans on earth, a hero in the eyes of many. All of this, and all you have to do is murder one old woman. What, now all of a sudden you don't like this idea? Does that disturb you? Do you feel scandalized that I would even propose such an idea? Trust me, no one would miss her. In fact, more than that, people would probably thank you for getting rid of the old hag. She's a menace and takes advantage of the poor through her shady business practices. The rates she charges for the unfair prices she gives people are criminal. Only desperation has led people to deal with her. So not only would you be freeing all sorts of impoverished people from their broker debts if you killed her and stole her money, but think of all the good you could do with that treasure. It's not fair that she has all of this and does literally nothing with it. No charity, no investment. She doesn't even spend it on herself. It just sits there like a dragon's hoard. She is a miserable wretch, and the world would be better without her. So, would you do it? That is one of the key questions asked in Fyodor Dostoevsky's absolute masterpiece novel that we have the pleasure of diving into today. I'm Jameson Olson. This is Becoming the Main Character. Let's get this party started. Yes, we're finally back. It was a long winter break, and I think I've learned my lesson. Do not try to do a novel this heavy with a long break in the middle, because when you come back to it, it just feels so much bigger than it was before you left it. So it's been a long road here, but we are back on track. Before I jump in, just because I've had so many parents reach out to me saying they love listening to my episodes with their kids, I feel the need to express that this story, in all its magnificence, is one you may want to think about before sharing. It's not like it's full of grotesque, explicit moments, but the themes throughout the entire story are pretty mature and gloomy, and I do feel like when there is violence, I can't water it down without affecting the story. So just keep that in mind. We open on a hot July evening. One of those days where the heat feels sticky like honey. We are following a young man as he leaves his residence, trying his best to avoid his landlady. He lives in what's called a garret in the story. It's not exactly a dorm room or a hostel, but it's definitely not as nice as a full-on apartment. So for our modern terminology, a tiny rundown dorm room type vibe is one of the best comparisons that I can come up with. The book says it was more like a cupboard than a room. He lived on the 5th floor, and the landlady lived below. So every time he came and went, he had to plan how to get past her door without being noticed, because he was massively in debt to her and wanted to avoid having to interact with her. Even the thought of being confronted about it made him feel sick and ashamed, but in a way that would actually lead to him feeling angry. That's like the trifecta of negative emotions right there: sick, ashamed, and angry. The book explains it this way. This was not because he was cowardly and abject, quite the contrary, but for some time past, he had been in an overstrained, irritable condition, verging on hypochondria. He had become so completely absorbed in himself and isolated from his fellows that he dreaded meeting not only his landlady, but anyone at all. So, this sticky July evening, he had successfully snuck down past her door, and he was on the street. He mutters to himself, "I want to attempt a thing like that? And yet I'm scared of something as simple as talking to my landlady?" He smiled at his self-perceived wisdom as he said, yes, all is in a man's hands, and he lets it all slip from cowardice. He was deep in thought about something we as the reader are not clued in on yet, but he makes reference to some plan he's been working on, largely while cooped up in his hovel alone for the past month. Am I going there now? Am I really capable of that? No, it's just a fantasy I use as a thought experiment. It's like a game for my mind to play. The narrator notes as we follow the man walking through the hot, dirty streets of mid-19th century St. Petersburg. that he was a young man who was exceptionally handsome, tall, slim, and well-built, with beautiful dark eyes and dark brown hair. And yet, despite all these physical advantages, he looked like he wasn't eating enough, and he was dressed in rags, essentially. It's noted that even someone used to shabbiness wouldn't dare to be seen dressed as poorly as this character. As we keep following the young man through the streets, passing through what is called the Haymarket, a place that we visit often in this book, it's kind of just a square among the poorer part of town, we are told that there is so much accumulated bitterness and contempt in the young man's heart that he couldn't care less about how poorly he was dressed. But when a drunkard called out to him in a mocking tone saying, "Hey there, German hatter," the young man clutched the tall, brimless hat he had been wearing, which he now realized was a very unique look and would easily be remembered. "I knew it," he muttered to himself as he yanked the hat off. "It's too noticeable. It looks absurd with these rags. I should be wearing a flat cap. This could be noticed a mile off. I can't be memorable for any reason. It's the little details that matter." He continued to berate himself for his foolishness. He was close. He actually knew exactly how many steps it was door to door from his room to his destination. He'd counted all 730 paces on his last visit. Back then, this wasn't a real plan. It was just an idea that teased him into, quote, daring recklessness. But that was a month ago, and now it didn't feel like a hideous dream. But, to be clear, this visit was not an attempt. This was a rehearsal, a chance to pay attention to the tiny details that could make or break his future effort. He had arrived at the door to the house. It was a tenement full of working-class people, tailors, cooks, clerks, etc. He started climbing the steps to the 4th floor. His breath quickened not just from the stairs, but from his nerves. He was berating himself again. If I'm scared now, what would it be like on the actual day? As he reached the 4th floor, he ran into porters. And in this time and place, think of porters as essentially the combination of a doorman, a maintenance man, and a security guard. They were essentially in charge of the building. So our young man saw several porters carrying furniture out of the only other tenement on this 4th floor. Apparently the German who had been living there was moving out. Good, he thought to himself. So she will be the only one living on this floor for a time. He reached the door to his destination, rang the bell, and focused on trying to slow his breathing. The door creaked open just enough for her scowling face to peer out at him. Just seeing her made him feel nauseous. She was a short, withered woman of over 60. Her sharp eyes held a sense of contempt in them. Her gray hair was plastered down with some thickly smeared oil. Despite the miserable heat, she was wearing a fur cape that was yellowed with age. She groaned and creaked every time she moved, and she was looking at her visitor with a leering gaze of distrust. "I am Raskolnikov, the student. I was here a month ago," he said, trying to fake pleasantness as much as he was able. "I remember you," was all she said, leaving them staring at each other in silence. Raskolnikov rushed his next sentence. "I am here again on a similar errand." Had she appeared this distrusting of him the first time he had been there? Because today it felt like she could sense he was up to something. But finally, she took a step back, opened the door, and said, "Come in, my good sir." Raskolnikov noted every detail he could. The yellowed wallpaper, the plants and muslin curtains. He even paid attention to how the sun was burning in through the windows of her 4th-story rooms at this time of day as it was about to set on the horizon. Nothing about her apartment was extraordinary. Old furniture, a few cheaply framed prints hung on the wall. But while nothing was lavish, it was all clean. The floors seemed freshly polished, and he noticed that this was obviously only due to Lizaveta. It's in the houses of spiteful old widows one finds such cleanliness, he thought to himself. There was one doorway with a cloth hanging as a divider. He'd only caught a glimpse of the room the last time he had been there. He knew it was her bedroom, but he also knew it held the chests full of her money and all of the pawned pledges that she was holding on to. His wandering eyes made the woman nervous, and she wanted to get to the point. "What do you want?" she said, standing in front of him. He says he's brought something to pawn. She says the 30-day limit on the last item he pawned is up, and that if she wants to sell it now, she is legally allowed to. He promises her that if she holds on to it, he'll have all the money to buy both items back soon. She seems to gloat about the power she has over him, and he asks her how much she will give him for the old-fashioned pocket watch he is holding out to her. It had a steel chain and was engraved with a globe on the back. She scoffs, saying that between the ring he'd already pawned to her and this, he only seems to bring her trifles. She claims she gave him more for the ring than it would have cost for her to buy it at a store. He begs her for 4 rubles for the watch, saying that it was his father's, hoping that added sentimental value might soften her heart. She didn't even consider the request. "1.5 rubles, plus interest in advance. That's my offer." "1.5 rubles, he exclaimed. Now, for this book, I'm not going to try too much to convert monetary value to modern USD, but for the sake of just understanding the scale of money in this story, from what I understand, you could get by, not living well, mind you, but as a lower income person, you could get by on 1 ruble a day, maybe. So an income of 30 rubles a month was enough to survive on. And so here he was basically asking for what would be a few $100 maybe in today's money. And she's basically saying she'll give him 30% of what he's requested. But the amount didn't really matter. Yes, this was actually his father's watch, but he hadn't come because he was trying to get 4 rubles out of her. This was a recon mission. So he pretended to struggle with the lowball offer before handing her the watch and saying he'll take it. And then he started noting every detail possible. The old woman, Alyona Ivanovna is her name, first fumbled in her pocket for a collection of keys, and then she disappeared behind the curtain to the other room. He had noted that the keyring held several keys. One of them was much bigger than the others. The smaller ones probably went to chests of drawers, but the big one was likely for a strongbox. He tried to note every sound from that side of the curtain. It had sounded like she'd unlocked a chest drawer, but very quickly she was back counting out cash. She was explaining her math out loud, saying that, the rate is 10 kopecks a month per ruble, which a ruble is 100 kopecks, by the way, meaning that she is to withhold 15 kopecks from this loan, plus she's taking the owed interest from the previous pawn out of this amount, so that's another 20 kopecks. So he asked for 4 rubles for the watch, and he is walking out of there with barely more than 1 ruble, and he now has 2 pawned items whose loans carry 120% annual interest. Raskolnikov took the money with a huff, even though he hadn't cared how much he got for the watch necessarily. It was these very predatory practices that had led him to entertaining the dark thought in the first place. So his anger was incensed, having to live through it again. He gave a long glance at the old money shark and finally said that he may have something else for her in a few days, something much more valuable, hinting that it was a silver cigarette case. He's waiting for a friend to deliver it. She just looked back at him and through her heavily lidded, lifeless eyes, said that they can talk about it when he has it in hand. On his way out, he tried as casually as possible to ask if she was always at home alone or if her sister wasn't often here with her. The old crone froze. "What business is that of yours?" she asked suspiciously. "Oh, nothing. Forget I even asked. Goodbye, Alyona Ivanovna." She eyed him until he rounded the corner to the stairs and disappeared from view. He struggled to get down the stairs, pausing multiple times as his thoughts raced. How loathsome is all of this, he thought to himself. Can I possibly? No, it's nonsense, rubbish. How could such an ugly thought even enter my head? Is my heart capable of such filthy things? He continued to shame himself for even having considered it as he reached the street. He felt dirty and wanted to cleanse himself of these thoughts, so he went to the nearest tavern, naturally. It was only after downing his first glass of beer that he felt his mind clear up. That was all nonsense, he said to himself. Nothing to worry about. He munched on some stale bread as he justified that he just needed to get out of the house and get some food in him so he could think straight. He smiled, now feeling relieved of a terrible burden, but he was still in a state of agitation. It's noted that in the tavern there are only a few others. There are two men sitting at a bench in their work clothes, one seemingly sleeping from his drunkenness and the other just sat there silently. But across the room was a man dressed in the uniform of a government clerk, sipping from his own mug of beer. And from appearances, he also seems quite agitated. Raskolnikov, as previously mentioned, had been avoiding human interaction lately, but now, in this moment of clarity, he felt a desire to engage with his fellow man. For the entire past month, he'd been consumed with this gnawing idea of committing an act that would have been so shameful to the world that he'd naturally separated himself, but now he longed to be among company again. Quote, there are chance meetings with strangers that interest us from the first moment before a word is spoken. And that was the case with Raskolnikov and the agitated fellow sitting in the corner of the room, the one that looked like some sort of government clerk. The man was over 50, bald and grizzled looking. His face was bloated and yellow, maybe even a little green from constant consumption of alcohol. Despite all the typical signs of alcoholism, there was a light in his eyes, a seeming intelligence that defied his ragged black coat that was missing most of its buttons. He was physically a mess from head to foot, but there was an air of confidence about the man. And finally, he locked eyes with Raskolnikov and introduced himself as Marmeladov, and he asked our young man if he was serving in the military. And as soon as this Marmeladov opened his mouth, all of those feelings of desiring to connect with his fellow man melted from Raskolnikov's mind at the prospect of actually having to talk to someone, which there are days where that is about the most relatable thing to me. But now I debated how much I wanted to dive into this chapter. It's honestly one of the longest in the entire book, but in it, Raskolnikov is not really a character, but a listener, an audience of Marmeladov who goes into great detail about his story, which we will get into, but just not super deep. But the reason I'm mentioning this struggle I had, instead of just summarizing it like I normally would, is that this is part of the magic of Dostoevsky. You have to be willing to go deep to appreciate it because it's not efficient storytelling in my mind. Most stories, especially on film these days, it's about cutting all the fat and making it as lean as possible. And that may be one of the reasons people struggle with authors like Fyodor, but it is one of the things that makes his writing so powerful, is what Dostoevsky is trying to attain with these side quest chapters like this one. He's introducing someone inconsequential for most of the story, but we learn enough about them that we can compare their worldview to the more significant characters. Because a villain presents a worldview that is contrary to the hero's. But what about someone who has a similar worldview to our hero with just one or two important tweaks that change things? Or someone who presents a very different worldview in a way that isn't necessarily opposed to the hero like a villain would be? Dostoevsky was as much a philosopher and a psychologist as he was a novelist. In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche famously said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. And that is why I do want to make a disclaimer up front, that although I do all the justice I can do for this novel in my work, and I think I do a fair amount of justice, it does not replicate the depth and the immersion that the novel can give you. If you're ready to put in the time, I don't think I've left more on the cutting room floor with any book I've covered so far than I have with this one. So, as much as I hope my episodes blow your mind, I want to be clear that if you have the mental space and patience to go through the book yourself, it will reward the effort. So, with that, here's what we need to know about Marmeladov, who is a minor character with significant impact to the story. He's one of those friendly drunks, and as soon as he realizes that Raskolnikov is a captive audience, he opens up way too much. He starts off sharing very personal details about how his wife had been beaten a month ago by a Mr. Lebeziatnikov, and forgive my Russian pronunciations, but he says how he's been sleeping in a hay barge the last few nights. And it's only then that our young man notices that this older man, in fact, does have several pieces of hay clinging to his clothes. The innkeeper, who seemed familiar with the man's antics and was apparently in a mood to be entertained by the wild answers the man gave, asked why he wasn't at his job if he was so nobly employed. "Why am I not at my duty?" Marmeladov repeated. Quote, "Does not my heart ache to think what a useless worm I am? Did I not suffer when Mr. Lebeziatnikov beat my wife while I lay drunk?" He goes on to confess that he is a dishonor to his wife, who is an educated woman and the daughter of an officer. He says that his oldest daughter has turned to prostitution to help support the family. He had been lamenting how every man needs some place to go where he can be pitied, and claims that his wife only pulls his hair when he fails her. But then in this stupor, he even admits that there was one time that she did feel for him, but because he is a beast by nature, it didn't do any good. And if this isn't making a ton of sense, I don't think it's supposed to at this point, so don't worry about it. These are the ramblings of a drunk intellectual. He confesses that he sold many of her possessions for drink and that the three little ones go hungry because of his drunkenness. And his wife works all day to try and keep their home, if you can call it that, clean as well as the children fed. But she has tuberculosis and is often weak herself. Do you suppose I don't feel it? And the more I drink, the more I feel it. That's why I drink too. I try to find sympathy and feeling in drink. I drink so that I may suffer twice as much. He says the three little ones are from Katerina's previous marriage to an infantry officer. That had been a union of true love, and even though they were hostile towards each other leading up to the man's death, she still spoke of him with reverence. Marmeladov is a widower and has the one daughter who was a teenager at the time of her mother's passing. He claims that he was so determined to do right by Katerina Ivanovna, which is his wife's name, when this woman of education in class consented to marry him, that he stayed off the drink for a year. But when he was unable to please her, even as a sober man, he fell back into his ways. The most absolutely gut-wrenching part of his entire story is one night he recalls when Katerina Ivanovna was upset at the lack of food and how her children were sick, and she was even sick herself. And she looked at her stepdaughter, Sonia, with a wretched contempt and began to yell at her about how she sleeps there and eats there, but she does not contribute to the family finances in any way. Marmeladov notes that she's tried honorable work, like mending clothes and ironing collars, but one, those types of jobs just pay almost nothing, and two, she had done several jobs where she did that labor and then she just was never even paid for it. Sonia was obviously distressed at the castigation and tried to defend herself, saying she's tried to work, but the aforementioned reasons explained why that hadn't helped. And then, almost as a way of asking her stepmother, what do you expect me to do? She mentions that a local madam had tried several times to recruit her to the oldest profession, using their landlady as a messenger. She said that almost as, do you care so much about me bringing in money that you want me to do that? And Katerina's response was coldly, and why not? Are you something mighty precious to be so careful of? It was 6 p.m. when this happened, and without another word, Sonia stood up, put on her shawl, and left the room. She came back at 9 p.m. and handed Katerina Ivanovna 30 rubles without saying anything. She then laid down on her bed, facing the wall, and began to shudder uncontrollably. Katerina, understanding everything that had taken place, and now being removed enough from her anger that had made her say such dreadful things, knelt at the bed and kissed her stepdaughter's feet, while tears fell from her eyes. But what is despicable about this story is Marmeladov admitting that he witnessed the entire thing from his own bed where he had been lying drunk the entire evening. After a pause in the story where Marmeladov took another sip of beer and Raskolnikov felt a sense of disgust for this man, he points out that obviously, now as a yellow passport holder, Sonia was not allowed to live with them anymore. The landlady just wouldn't allow it. And for context, prostitution was legal in a sense. To do it legally, you had to file for what is called a yellow passport, which gave you license to work in the sex trade, but it also came with plenty of downsides. So before you go thinking, wow, that's pretty progressive of 19th century Russia, it's more like they saw a way to make money off of prostitution at the government level while also ostracizing those in the trade, because things like refusal of housing or other types of jobs was permittable if you had a yellow passport. So it was not just the moral degradation of Sonia's choice. She was taking on a burden that included being a societal outcast in the eyes of the law because her father was too much of a drunk to provide for his family. The last story from Marmeladov before he starts justifying himself in even greater detail can be summarized by saying that in a rare moment of sobriety, he had gotten a job as a clerk for an official and worked the job long enough to get his first paycheck of more than 20 rubles. That day, he had brought it home for his wife, and she treated him so well. She called him Poppet and caressed his face. But by the next day, he had stolen all the money, abandoned the job, and here he finds himself after 5 days of drinking and sleeping in a hay barge at night. He takes a sick sort of pride in degrading himself by admitting even further that very morning he'd shown up at his daughter's apartment and asked her for more money, which he was currently drinking from that amount. He admits it was all the money she had at the time. She gave it to him without a word, and he has the audacity to say that this shame is greater and his pain more because she didn't blame or chastise him. The innkeeper and the other men in the tavern who had all been listening expressed their contempt for this man who would do such a thing, and Marmeladov says he knows he is a beast, but then goes on to say he knows he will be forgiven by Christ, that he is already forgiven, that Christ will also forgive his Sonia, that in the day of judgment Almighty God will say, "Come forth, ye drunkards, come forth, ye weak ones, ye children of shame. Ye are swine made in the image of the beast with his mark, but come ye also." Now, at the end of his ramblings, he says it is time for his penance and asks Raskolnikov to join him on his way home. He had to lean on the young man quite a bit because of his unstable nature, and the closer they get, the more Marmeladov seems to be afraid of meeting his judgment. And when they reached the place, it was just as miserable as Raskolnikov's own garret. Although it was a larger room, it was not enough space for 2 adults and 3 children, and remember that Sonia had been living there until recently. Their room was not even fully private, as there were entries to other rooms where other people were living on both ends. So it was basically like living in a large hallway. As soon as Katerina Ivanovna saw her husband, she left from the little child she had been trying to console to chew this man out. "He has come back, the criminal, the monster. Where is the money?" She began to go through his pockets. And when she realizes that he is drunken at all, she grabs him by the hair and scolds him as she dragged him across the room on his knees. Marmeladov was spouting intellectual babble about how this didn't hurt him, this was a consolation for his sin. Katerina continued yelling at him until she realized there was another man in there, looking at Raskolnikov. She assumed he was a drinking buddy of Marmeladov's and began to chew him out, yelling at him to leave. There was a laughter of other people who had been peering through one of the doorways at this scene. Katerina didn't even wait for Raskolnikov to leave before she began beating and cursing her husband again. The laughter from the onlookers grew louder, the children were crying, almost without thinking. Raskolnikov reached into his pocket, pulled out the ruble and change from his own pawning, and placed it on the mantel in the room before walking out. As he reached the street, he cursed himself. "Why did I do that? They have Sonia. I needed that money for myself." He then began to reflect on the strange occurrence and laughed sinisterly at the thought of the gold mine the family now had in a daughter who had turned to prostitution solely for the purpose of sustaining the little ones. What a scoundrel. But he catches himself in a thought. Quote, "What if man is not really a scoundrel? Man in general, I mean. The whole race of mankind. Then all the rest is prejudice. Simply artificial terrors, and there are no barriers. And it's all as it should be." As we go deeper, you'll see how Marmeladov isn't done in the story, nor is his family, but he has played his biggest role already. And if you still feel like I gave plenty of detail on him, wait till you read the chapter yourself. But the next morning, Raskolnikov woke after a fitful sleep, and we get a detailed description of the hole that he is living in. Quote, 6 paces in length, dusty yellow wallpaper that was peeling off the walls. The ceilings angled to the point where any tall man like himself would struggle to stand upright and not feel like you were going to hit your head. There were a few rickety chairs, a lone table in the corner, and the junky sofa that served as his bed. The narrator notes that it would have been hard for him to sink any lower than this level of disorder. But in his own mind, he was doing well enough for his needs. While he was ruminating in his wretched space, Nastasia, the cook and servant of the house, came in with tea. Since he was far behind on his rent, the landlady wasn't making sure he got his meals like she would have if he was part of a normal rental agreement, but Nastasia would still look after him from time to time. And she warns him that the landlady, Praskovya Pavlovna, is saying she's going to complain to the police about Raskolnikov not paying rent. The young man calls his landlady a fool, and Nastasia agrees with him, but then in turn asks why he doesn't do something about finding work. Her words were, "Why, if you were so clever, do you lay here like a sack and have nothing to show for it?" He can't come up with a very good answer, but ultimately, he says that the pay is so little for lessons these days. What can he do with just a few coppers? She laughs at his claim of wanting to be rich, despite not even working to pay his rent. And then, as she gets up to leave, she remembers that a letter had come for him the day before, and he practically barks at her to go get it. It was a very thick envelope with very detailed handwriting. It was from his mother. "My dear Rodia," it opened. "It's been 2 months since you wrote last." She apologizes for not having been able to send him more money lately, explaining that the previous 15 rubles she'd sent months ago had been borrowed against her pension and that loan had just been paid off. But she teases that something has happened that hopefully will change all of that and will allow him to receive the financial aid he needs. She then notes that his sister Dunya is back living with her after having gone through horrors working in the Svidrigailov household. She says she is glad that he is only learning of these details now that Dunya is back and that the story has a happier ending, because otherwise she fears Raskolnikov would have come back from St. Petersburg and would have caused more trouble. What we learn about Dunya's situation is that she took a job as a governess. She was paid 100 rubles, so again, maybe 3 months' pay in basic estimations, as an advance, and a portion of each paycheck was removed until the advance was restored. So she had been under legal obligation to stay at the job until the advance was paid. And his mother confesses that his sister had agreed to the advance mostly so she could send him 60 rubles that one time that we don't learn how long ago it was. Apparently, when that money had been sent, they'd claimed it came from Dunya's savings, so this is news to him about her taking a loan on his behalf. But back to the tortures of the Svidrigailov household. Lady Marfa and the children were kind and well-behaved when she first started working there, but it was Mr. Svidrigailov who was rude and disrespectful towards the young governess, but that may have been preferable to what actually happened, because at first it just seemed like he warmed up to her, but in the way that you don't want a man of his age and position to warm up to you. The book says he conceived a passion for Dunya. That's quite a way of saying you've got a crush. I have conceived a passion for you. But he conceived a passion for Dunya are his mother's words, and she writes that maybe he was rude to her in public just to hide the truth from how he felt in reality. But eventually he confessed this fiery love for Dunya and offered to take her away from it all, taking her abroad and offering other wild promises. Dunya, of course, was not tempted in the slightest by this, but now found herself in the impossible situation of being financially obligated to stay in the job, but having to ward off Svidrigailov's advances, which he confessed to her often. She made it 6 weeks of this delicate dance of working while pretending nothing had happened, but unfortunately, Marfa Petrovna eventually overheard one of her husband's passionate declarations of love to Dunya in the garden. And Marfa assumed Dunya must have been guilty of flirting with her husband, tempting him into making such declarations. She became physically violent towards Dunya, screamed at her for an entire hour before banishing her from the house, forcing her to return the 11 miles home in an open peasant's cart in the rain, rather than giving her a carriage like a respectable woman. But it didn't stop there, however. The townspeople began to treat them both wickedly, Dunya and her mother. They smeared the gate to their house with tar, which made their landlord tell them they had to leave. That act, smearing a tar on a gateway, was an old practice I discovered that was basically the way for a community to mark a household as guilty or unworthy without using the legal system. It was a soft use of mob justice. I say soft because no physical harm is done, but it's a way to socially condemn people. They learned that it was because Marfa Petrovna had been filling everyone's ears with evil stories about how Dunya had tried to steal her husband. Other trials were caused because of this slander, but eventually, Mr. Svidrigailov felt too guilty and confessed to his wife that Dunya had nothing to do with it. Everything that had happened was his own idea. He even showed her a letter from Dunya begging him to leave her alone. And she even reproached him for how wicked his behavior was as a father and husband. The letter was so moving to Marfa Petrovna that she was crushed to realize all the pain she had caused this young girl. And by young, we assume she's about 20 years old, but we don't ever get an exact age. Marfa immediately came to them and repented of all the pain she had caused them, but she didn't stop there. She knew she had done a lot of reputation damage with the community and felt like her restoration would not be complete until everyone knew the truth. So she basically took the letter door to door, showing how she had been wrong to make such evil claims against such a noble young woman. And that's how we get to the final portion of the letter, Dunya's new suitor. His name is Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin. Marfa Petrovna basically set them up. He is a distant relative of hers, after all. It's very clear how Dostoevsky introduces us to this character because the mother writes about him as if she has nothing but good to say about the man, and yet as the reader, we start feeling like he's a greasy character pretty quickly. It starts when she notes how busy of a man he is and how straight to the point he makes his matters. He basically made an offer of marriage to Dunya after only one coffee with the two ladies. She writes that he holds 2 government positions and is well off financially, and despite him being 45, which again, remember, I think Dunya's 20 plus, so despite that age gap and despite his age, some ladies may still find him handsome, is how she puts it. And then his mother begs him to not judge the man severely like he is known to do, that in order to understand any man, one must be deliberate and careful to avoid forming prejudices and mistaken ideas, which are very difficult to correct and get over afterwards. And she claims that by many indications, this Pyotr Petrovich is a thoroughly estimable man. See, it's stuff like that. She's not overly complimentary. She doesn't seem excited about the prospect of this marriage. No claims of admiration for him beyond these types of logical statements. It's like she's saying, well, there are enough metrics which he seems to be good enough on. But she admits that there is no great love on either side of this planned union. But that Dunya, who is a clever girl and has the heart of an angel, will make it her duty to make her husband happy. She comments in the letter on how everything is moving pretty fast, but she assumes it's just that he is a very prudent man, and that once he is certain a marriage will make him happy, he doesn't want to waste time. And here's the kicker. The thing that if his mother had wanted him to give this Pyotr Petrovich a chance, she should have left out of the letter. But either she is totally oblivious or she included it as a cry for help for him to blow up this wedding if he gets the chance, because she comments, mostly just as evidence of how outspoken this Mr. Luzhin is, that he had declared on their second meeting that before he'd ever met Dunya, he had decided he wanted to marry a girl of good reputation who had experienced poverty. Because as a man with some means to offer, it is better for a wife to be indebted to her husband. Apparently, even he had been aware of how this could come off. Once he'd said it, he tried to smooth things over. But in summary, the letter ends with these pieces of info. First is the fact that Dunya is marrying this man, assuming that she will be able to influence him greatly. Among those influences, she thinks she can leverage his positions in the government to help her brother Rodia have a good career in the law. But most excitedly, she announces that they are on their way to St. Petersburg. The family will be reunited shortly. But the cherry on top of this suspect man's description is that this new fiancé of Dunya's, who is the reason they are coming to Petersburg, has not even arranged for the travel of the two ladies. He's paid for their luggage to be sent, but he's making them figure out how they will get to this new city where he wants them to move. Raskolnikov reads the last part of the letter where his mother expresses her blessings and love, saying that he is the family's one hope and consolation. If only you are happy, we shall be happy, she says. She inquires about his faith, asking if he still prays, noting that she has a fear that he may have been visited by a new spirit of infidelity that is abroad today. Don't worry, we'll get into that part later. But the letter is signed, yours till death, Pulcheria Raskolnikov. As he clutched the letter, tears fell from his face. He'd been crying essentially the entire time, but by the end, his face was pale and distorted with bitterness. He stewed in his room until it felt stifling, and then he began to wander the streets, muttering to himself in his anger as he went. Okay, before we continue, I want to explain how Russian names work to you, at least at this point in time. You've heard our main character called Raskolnikov, and yet the letter opened My Dear Rodia, and the fiancé is called Pyotr Petrovich, but his last name is Luzhin. Okay, it turns out there was a 3-name system, at least back then. I haven't checked if that's currently how things are. But you had a first name, a patronymic name, which identified you as the son or daughter of your father, and then you had the family name. So our main character's full name is actually Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. First name Rodion, Romanovich means son of Roman, and Raskolnikov is the last name. The fiancé is Pyotr Petrovich, last name Luzhin. And Rodia is a more intimate, affectionate, shortened version of Rodion. So at times we'll hear him called Raskolnikov, Rodion, Rodia by his loved ones, and sometimes called Rodion Romanovich. Because in this book, at least, you never hear someone just called by the patronymic name, but you will sometimes see it paired with the first name. And to try to solidify this just a bit more, one more example, we've heard his sister only called Dunya at this point, but it turns out Dunya is the shortened, intimate version of her first name, which is Avdotya. Her full name is Avdotya Romanovna Raskolnikov. And through the book, you'll hear characters called different combinations of first name, last name, or first and patronymic. I'll try to point out the new iterations of names for characters as they pop up. Rodion had a lot of thoughts about this letter from his mom, but they can largely be summed up with one thought that he expresses, saying, "Never such a marriage while I am alive, and Mr. Lusion be damned." He is also angry with his mom and sister. The fact that they made such an important decision and in a rush, seemingly to keep him from objecting to it, the fact that his sister is planning on marrying a man who his mother could at best claim seems to be kind. That seems was the craziest word he read. The fact that they were gambling so much of Dunya's future for someone who seems to be anything infuriated him. At one point, she begged her dear Rodia to love his sister because she loves him more than anything. Was this his mother's guilty conscience, knowing she was willing to sacrifice her daughter's happiness for her son? She'd even said it openly at the end that he was their one hope and happiness. Was he not to plainly see this choice was not made for Dunya's benefit, but for his? His bitterness grew more and more intense, and if he had met that Mr. Lusion in that very moment, he might have murdered him. The fact that this seemingly kind man had arranged for the lady's luggage to be transported the 60 miles but was making them ride on a peasant's cart seemed to tell Rodion everything he needed to know about the man. He felt anger at his mother for believing this man could offer any sort of happiness to Dunya. He felt anger at Dunya, who obviously knew he was not a good man, but was willing to enter into this arrangement for her brother's welfare. But obviously, he was most angry at this Mr. Lusion, who was just a terrible person. He sees it as if his sister is entering into a form of prostitution with this union. No, she's not being paid for sex, but she is selling herself in order to provide for the ones she loves. The narrator crystallizes this, saying, quote, "In such cases, we overcome our moral feeling if necessary. Freedom, peace, conscience even, all are brought into the market. Let my life go if only my dear ones may be happy." It's clear to Raskolnikov that everything his mom and sister have done and are doing is for him. The advance from the Svidrigailovs, the fast engagement to Petrovich, none of these choices were for their own happiness. Everything was to try and keep him in school and get him to be a lawyer. For Dunya, it may be a genuine and pure love for her brother, but for his mother, yes, she loved him more than anything, and she claimed to desire only his happiness. But there was an underlying tone to everything, that she needed him to be successful. His ability to become something was the only way she would feel like she had been successful as a mother. So although her love for her son was real, there was also this expectation, and she was willing to sacrifice her own comforts in order to see that expectation realized. And Rodion hated this pressure. He sees parallels between the choices that the Raskolnikov women are making to the choice of that Sonia who entered prostitution just to keep bread on the table for the children who aren't even her blood relatives. In fact, he thought of Sonia's life and didn't imagine it could be much worse than the life Dunya had signed herself up for, to be the grateful, destitute wife of a well-to-do man. No, he thought, not while I am around. As long as I'm breathing, this marriage will not happen. I won't let them sacrifice themselves for me like this. But his next thoughts taunted him and showed just how tortured his mind was. It shall not be, but what are you going to do to prevent it? You'll forbid it? And what right have you? What can you promise them on your side to give such a right? Your whole life, your whole future, you will devote to them when you have finished your studies and obtained a post? Yes, we have heard all that before, and that's all words. But now something must be done. Now, do you understand that? And what are you doing now? You are living upon them. They borrow on their hundreds rubles pension they borrowed from the Svidrigailovs. How are you going to save them from people like the Svidrigailovs and this Lusion? Oh, you future millionaire Zeus who would arrange their lives for them. When? In another 10 years? In another 10 years, your mother will be blind from knitting shawls, maybe with weeping, too. She will be worn to a shadow with fasting. And your sister? Imagine for a moment what may have become of her in 10 years. What may happen to her during those 10 years? Can you fancy? He resolved that he had to do something. Because if he wasn't willing to act, the only other choice was to accept life as it was and suffer passively. And then the question from the drunk Marmeladov struck him again. Do you understand, sir, what it means when you have absolutely nowhere to turn? For every man must have somewhere to turn. And then another thought he'd had yesterday came back to his mind. Despite having felt so relieved when it had left him the day before, he wasn't necessarily surprised that it had come back. He'd had that thought many times over the past month, after all, but there was something different about the thought this time. It felt less like a dream and more like a plan. After more pondering on the wicked nature of the world, he stopped to ask himself why he had even left the house. Where was he going? Oh, right, to Razumihin, his old friend from the university days. Raskolnikov had not had many friends, mostly because of his own personality and temperament, but it was impossible not to be on good terms with Razumihin. He was, quote, an exceptionally good-humored and candid youth to the point of simplicity, though both depth and dignity lay concealed under that simplicity. A tall, thin man with black hair and always a scruffy beard, a strong man who once got in a fight with a cop, his drinking powers knew no limits, and sometimes he was too much of a prankster for his own good. But Razumihin was one of the good ones. The narrator notes that one striking feature is that no failure distressed him and no unfavorable circumstance could crush him. So shout out to that Sherlock Holmes lesson that fits in with this characterization. Although in this case, it's specifically referring to his ability to sleep anywhere and not need physical comforts to be happy, he could always find a way to make money when it was necessary. And Raskolnikov knew that his friend had also been required to give up school due to finances for a time. But even as he walked, he started questioning why he was heading to him in the first place. What was he going to do? Try to get a job teaching lessons for a pittance? Even if Razumihin gave him his last farthing, it wouldn't change the bigger picture. No, it wouldn't do any good to visit his friend now. He will go to him the day after it, when he is ready to begin a fresh life. He froze. He shuddered to realize what he'd just done. After it, by the way, is capitalized in the book in this instance. Is it really going to happen? He'd never expressed the idea so concretely in the past tense as if it was certainly going to occur. He began walking the streets again, frightened of himself. Raskolnikov was muttering to himself again. No, yesterday when I did my little rehearsal, I realized I could never actually see it through. My reasoning was all clear-headed and still made sense, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Never, never. But if I can't do it, why am I still thinking about it? He was pale, his entire body ached, and he took long breaths to slow down his thoughts. And finally, he uttered words he hadn't said in a long time. He said a prayer. Lord, show me a path. I renounce that cursed dream of mine. He felt the burden lift from him once more, and he began to work his way home. He passed through the Haymarket where he saw Lizaveta, the sister of the pawnbroker. Lizaveta is described like this. Quote, she was a single woman of about 35, tall, clumsy, timid, submissive, and almost idiotic. She was a complete slave and went in fear and trembling of her sister, who made her work day and night and even beat her. So although she's never diagnosed with anything specific, it is mentioned several times that there's something slow about Lizaveta, some form of developmental disability that makes the fact that she's basically a slave to her sister all the more abhorrent. All the more reason to hate the old pawning hag. Lizaveta was talking to some people in the Haymarket, and he didn't stop to listen as he walked by, but in passing he heard the one thing that condemned him to change the course of his life forever. He heard an appointment being made. The couple that Lizaveta was talking to were inviting her to come over the next day at 7 for some tea, specifically noting that she shouldn't tell her sister where she is, and he heard Lizaveta agree. At this point, Raskolnikov had moved past and they were out of earshot. His first amazement was followed by a thrill of horror, like a shiver running down his spine. He had learned very unexpectedly that the next day at 7 o'clock, the old woman's sister and only companion would not be home. And therefore, at 7 o'clock, precisely, the old woman would be alone. When he got home, he went in like a man condemned to death. He was incapable of thinking. In his mind, he no longer had free will. Everything was decided. One of the hardest things to pull off was going to be guaranteeing a window where the hag would be alone, and now it had been handed to him as if this was fate. Quote, the next day at a certain time, an old woman on whose life an attempt was contemplated would be at home and entirely alone. Now, it's interesting to note in terms of just the writing, this is the first time where it is explicitly stated that the idea in his mind is to take the woman's life. He doesn't use super cryptic language, so we've been assuming it from the start, but I paid attention, and this is the first time, 5 chapters in, where he actually says that the goal is murder. And at this point, we get a brief flashback to when this all started, supposedly. The moment that first put the idea in his head that he's been wrestling with for over a month now. It started with the first time he had gone to Alyona Ivanovna's to pawn a ring. And he remembers how immediately he felt repulsion from the first time he saw her. He got 2 rubles for the ring that he pawned, which had been a gift from Dunya when he'd left home. And he went straight to a tavern where he asked for tea. He was intrigued when he overheard 2 others talking about the pawnbroker. There was a student and an officer. The student was telling his friend, the officer, about how reliable she was for taking anything of remote value. He claims she could give pledges ranging from 1 ruble to 5,000, but despite being rich enough to be a useful pawnbroker, he shares how everyone thinks she's an awful old harpy, how she imposed severe penalties for being late on payments, and how she was cruel to her sister Lizaveta, who we learn is only the broker's half-sister, which explains the massive age gap between them. It's like 35 years or so. Rumor had it that the old crone had pledged all of her money not to her sister upon death, but to some monastery so that prayers would be said in her name forever. I could kill the damned old woman, I assure you, the student said. He chuckled at this statement. The officer laughed as well. And Raskolnikov was hooked at how this conversation was happening right after he had been to the old woman, and he had also felt so repulsed by her. The student chuckled as he prefaced his next statement by saying that the last thing he had said had been a joke, but he asks this next question in earnest. He says there is this spiteful, ailing, wretched, mean old woman on one hand who doesn't have much life left regardless, and her money will only go to some monastery. Then you have thousands of young people who are struggling to even get by, young people with energy and strong desires to do good, a willingness to benefit their fellow man. 100,000 good deeds could come from these people who first off just need a little help. And that money could come from the pawnbroker's hoard, which is currently set to just be enveloped by a bunch of monks. Think of all the families that could be saved, the young people who could launch their careers, save them from vice. All it would take is someone to kill that old woman, take her money, and devote themselves to being a service to humanity with all of that treasure. He then poses one of the oldest questions in all of human history. Would not one tiny crime be wiped out by thousands of good deeds? After a pause long enough for that question to embed itself in Raskolnikov's head like a worm, the student continued, adding that it's not even as simple as the good that could be done in her absence. It's the fact that the woman is contributing to the suffering of the world as long as she keeps on living. Her sister suffers as her slave. The hundreds of people who turn to her in desperation for a bit of financial relief, only to be lowballed and hit with astronomical fines if they're late. There's so much suffering that she is responsible for. The officer responded saying that, of course, the woman does not deserve to live, but says that that's just the way of things. The student, who seemed more willing to harbor darker thoughts, said, "Oh, well, but we have to correct and direct nature. We would never have made it anywhere if not for a willingness to change the course of nature." The officer looked nervous. "Would you kill the old woman yourself?" he asked in barely more than a whisper. As if desperate to throw off any suspicion, the student laughed loudly. "Of course not. I was just arguing for the justice of it." But the officer made a strong counterpoint, saying, "If you would not do it yourself, there is no justice about it." Then the 2 talkers changed topics completely, leaving Raskolnikov alone, quote, violently agitated. Why had he happened to hear such a discussion and such ideas at the very moment when his own brain was just conceiving the very same thoughts. This coincidence had always seemed strange to him. This trivial talk in a tavern had an immense influence on him in his later actions, as though there had really been in it something preordained, some guiding hint. Okay, let's examine something that is on my mind at this point in the story. This is the second instance. Chronologically, this is actually the first, but this is the second instance where Raskolnikov feels pulled to this dark act by fate. Now, you'd probably guess that my angle on this would be that you always have a choice, and you're right, but I will be quick to admit there is a certain allure of the fate angle. When you feel like you're seeing signs, it's not as simple as just logically saying, well, that's not what I want, so I don't care if that looks like a sign. But we feel a desire to justify things as fate, and I wanted to understand why. So I spent a little time digging into the possible reasons why the fate angle is so attractive to us at times, and here is the most valuable stuff for you to consider. Let's look at Raskolnikov. In this case, he doesn't believe in fate because fate is real. He believes in fate because it solves 3 potential psychological problems at once. First, we have moral anesthesia. When we call something fate, it lets you offload responsibility. In psychology, it's called moral disengagement, as if to say, if I chose this, I'm guilty. But if the universe chose me, I'm just an instrument. Fate numbs conscience without requiring self-deception. The second possibility is that it gives you relief from unbearable freedom. This is straight out of Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher, where he said, we are condemned to be free, which sounds appealing at first until you realize that every choice fully belongs to you with no cosmic excuse. There's no safety net if we are truly free. Fate becomes like a psychological relief because you can say, I didn't choose it, I was chosen. And the last reason I will cover is that there is a seduction of significance because fate doesn't just remove guilt, it adds meaning. When coincidences start to feel like signs, a private crime can be reframed as a historical act. And Raskolnikov doesn't just want permission, he wants importance. Believing in fate can turn an ugly choice into something that feels necessary. And those 3 things together become a very lethal combination. When we feel less guilt, when we feel less freedom over our choices, and we feel more meaning from what we do, that's why the idea of fate is so seductive. And the way I look at it, this is Dostoevsky's real accusation here. He isn't saying that fate sometimes pushes people towards evil. It's almost like he's saying evil prefers that you believe it to be necessary. Fate is the story we tell ourselves when we want the outcome without owning the authorship. But even with this belief that fate is calling him to do it, Rodion is still going through his own struggles with the idea. So much so that he spends more time wrestling with it to the point of being ill. Nastasia, the cook maid, remember, was worried about him. He slept fitfully, having bizarre dreams, and he slept through much of the day, only waking up to the clock striking. He wasn't 100% positive how many times it had struck, but by the position of the sun, his best bet was that it was 6 p.m., 1 hour before Lizaveta would be gone. In his feverish condition, he hadn't prepared anything yet, and now he only had 1 hour to get ready. He concentrated all of his energies into thinking of everything and forgetting nothing. He sewed a loop or a noose on the inside of his jacket. He then dug under the sofa for his pledge of a silver cigarette case, which was actually just a block of wood about the size of a cigarette case. He then proceeded to wrap it in several layers of very tight packaging and tying very tight knots around it so that it would become a chore to unwrap. The goal was to divert the woman's attention long enough for him to strike. But going back to the noose in his jacket, this is actually a pretty genius choice on his part. The noose was for him to be able to carry an axe through the streets without being seen holding the weapon. The noose allowed him to basically do a concealed carry of an axe. And even as he was making these final preparations, there was part of him that still didn't believe he was going through with it. Weeks ago, while he had first begun to entertain the idea, he found himself asking why so many crimes were so terribly concealed. There was always evidence left everywhere. He had considered many possibilities, but decided that most of them must just fall to the inability of the criminal to keep their wits during the crime itself. Whether you had a cool head and a good plan going into it, He thinks most just don't have the ability to keep it together while in the heat of the moment. He, of course, considered himself above this because what he was doing was not a crime necessarily in his mind, but a necessity. Again, fate was telling him it had to be done. But now, as the hour approached, he could feel his own calm demeanor slipping away. He stole the axe from the porter's woodshed and went off to the pawnbroker's home. Luck seemed to be favoring him. The street was busy enough with wagons and other traffic that one more pedestrian wouldn't stand out very much. But once he was through the front door of her building, he stared at the staircase and he felt his heart sink. By the time he'd gotten there, the bells were already striking 7:30. He didn't have much time. Who knew how long Lizaveta would be away? He put his hand on his chest to feel his heartbeat, but to also feel his fingertips touch the axe blade under his coat. A reminder of his preparation and commitment. And then he started up the stairs. He was watchful of any signs of life on any floor. The porter hadn't been out front. No one was outside of their apartment doors. He met no one on the stairs. The only sign of life was on the second floor. There was one door open where he could hear painters working inside, but he didn't see them and they couldn't see him. He made it up to the third and then to the fourth floor. It was just the empty apartment across the hall and then her den of predatory pawning practices. He was breathing heavily. Sure, the stairs took it out of him, but he was breathing more heavily than just that. He briefly thought about going back. Before knocking, he stood in silence, listening for any signs that anyone else was even close to this place. He did his best to not look agitated. She was already a skeptical person. If he appeared to be hiding something, this wouldn't work. His heart beat, not with cowardice, but with a driving determination to see this through. And finally, after what seemed like ages of standing at her door, he rang the bell. The silence buried him as he waited for footsteps, but there was no sound. He rang again and waited longer, but he chose not to ring a third time. If she was home, there was no way she would not have heard it. Either she was gone or she was ignoring him. So he just waited. But just as he was about ready to give up, he heard a hand gently toggle a lock on the other side of the door. She must have been standing there, listening in silence the whole time. He moved to the side a bit so she would be able to see him just opening the door a crack. He didn't want to give off any impression of trying to hide anything from her. As the curtain went up on this scene of murderous intent, Raskolnikov couldn't help but feel some level of pride at his genius for putting together means and opportunity for this moment. He smiled ever so slightly as the latch on the door opened. "Good evening, Alyona Ivanovna," he said as casually as he could muster, but he could tell there was tension in his voice. She looked more cautious than usual. He almost pushed his way past her into the room, and he marched towards the window. She hurried after him, so startled that she apparently hadn't even recognized him. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Why, it's me, Raskolnikov," he said, forcing a laugh. "I have the pledge I promised you the other day." He held out the tightly bundled block of wood masquerading as a cigarette case. She looked down at the object, then back at him, then back at the parcel. Every moment that she didn't grab it from his hands felt like condemnation to him. How stupid was he to think this would work? How foolish enough was he to try passing off a block of wood as something valuable? Her stare pricked at his mind. "Why do you look at me as if you don't know me?" he said. "I told you I would bring this by. If you don't want it, I'll be on my way. I have more things to do tonight." At the idea of losing on a precious object she was almost guaranteed to end up owning from this young man who wore rags and kept pawning new items, she softened up. She took the package and commented on how pale the young man looked and how even his hands were trembling. "Have you been ill?" she asked. "Fever," he sputtered. "Hadn't had much to eat." She had been struggling with the tight strings on the package and turned to the window to get a better look at the knots. "But what has he tied it up like this for?" she muttered to herself in vexation. He had not a minute more to lose. With her back to him, he pulled the axe quite out, swung it with both arms, scarcely conscious of himself, and almost without effort, almost mechanically, brought the blunt side down on her head. He seemed not to use his own strength in this, but as soon as he had once brought the axe down, his strength returned to him. The old woman was, as always, bareheaded. Her thin, light hair streaked with gray, thickly smeared with grease, was plaited in a rat's tail and fastened by a broken horn comb, which stood out on the nape of her neck. As she was so short, the blow fell on the very top of her skull. She cried out, but very faintly, and suddenly sank all of a heap on the floor. Raising her hands to her head, in one hand she still held the pledge. Then he dealt her another and another blow with the blunt side, and on the same spot, the blood gushed as from an overturned glass. The body fell back. He stepped back, letting it fall, and at once bent over her face. She was dead. Her eyes seemed to be starting out of their sockets. The brow and the whole face were drawn and contorted convulsively. He put the axe down and fumbled through her pockets until he found the keys she had pulled out in his last visit. He seemed pretty calm and collected considering what he'd just done. He went into the bedroom with the keys. He started trying the different keys on the chest where he assumed the most valuable items would be. As he tried one key, and a second, and a third, his nerves began to falter. His mind began to propose the idea of giving up on all of this and running out of the door right now. No, he said to himself, it's too late for that now. As he tried more keys, his panicked mind proposed more frightening ideas, like, what if she wasn't actually dead? This one bothered him enough that he left the keys to go out and grab the axe. He held it over her motionless body, but never felt the need to bring it down on her. He could see the breaks in her skull, and there was a growing pool of blood underneath her. But while he stared, he noticed a string around her neck. He wrenched it off to find a purse attached. Inside were 2 crosses, one of wood, one of copper, and a smaller leather purse that was stuffed full of valuables. He tossed the crosses onto her corpse and shoved the leather purse in his pocket. This time, he carried the axe into the room with him. He began trying the keys again, but none of them seemed to be working. It didn't help that his hands were shaking. But if you remember, there was one key bigger than the others which he had assumed must be to a lockbox. So he began to search the room for the box, and he found it under her bed. The notched key opened it easily, and on top of whatever valuables were inside was a finely woven brocade, which is apparently a heavy fabric with ornate designs. It was red, and without thinking, Raskolnikov wiped his bloody hands on it. He caught himself having the conscious thought of the fact that the blood would be less noticeable on red fabric, and then he paused to see how insane he sounded. Was he losing it? Inside the chest were many gold pieces, watches, chains, earrings, pins, etc. He had just started stuffing his pockets with whatever looked valuable when he heard steps in the next room. He stopped moving, but his ragged breaths felt like screams to his ears. There was a soft, moaning cry through the curtained doorway, and then silence for well over a minute. After gathering himself enough, Raskolnikov, axe in hand, jumped through the doorway, ready to face whatever was on the other side. It was Lizaveta, standing in the middle of the room, holding a bundle in her arms. She was staring dumbfounded at her dead sister. She'd been standing like that in silence for at least a couple minutes, except for that one moan. At the sight of Raskolnikov, Lizaveta began to shudder uncontrollably. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. She backed away from him, staring in absolute terror at the man holding an axe with blood-stained hands. She still made no sound. She couldn't gather enough of a breath to scream. Raskolnikov moved towards her. Her mouth twitched the way a baby's mouth does when it starts to feel afraid. And this hapless Lizaveta was so simple and had been so thoroughly crushed and scared that she did not even raise a hand to guard her face. Though that was the most necessary and natural action at the moment, for the axe was raised over her face. She only put up her empty left hand, but not to her face, slowly holding it out before her as though motioning him away. The axe fell with the sharp edge just on the skull and split at one blow at the top of the head. She fell heavily at once. Raskolnikov completely lost his head, snatching up her bundle, dropped it again, and ran into the entryway. Raskolnikov was not nearly as composed after this second unexpected murder of an innocent. Remember, he had completely justified the murder of the older sister because of her own wickedness, but Lizaveta had never done anything to anyone. She wasn't sharp enough to act with malice to anybody. The narrator notes that if he had been able to realize the difficulties of his position, the hopelessness, the hideousness, the absurdity of it, if he had understood how many more obstacles and even crimes he would still have to commit just to get home, it's very possible he would have flung up everything and would have gone to give himself in, and not from fear, but from simple horror and loathing of what he had done. The feeling of loathing especially surged up within him and grew stronger every minute. Nothing in the world could have made him go back into the room to try to collect more valuables. After sitting in this whirlwind of madness, he finally broke himself out of the trance enough to wash his hands and the axe in the bucket of water and soap from the kitchen. It took him several minutes to get the blood off the handle, which were several minutes he should have been distancing himself from the crime scene. He came back from washing the axe feeling pretty good about his efforts. Remember, this is pre-DNA testing, so it didn't matter if his blood was still in the bucket. As long as he was not there, they weren't finding him. But with a single glance, his blood ran cold one more time. Because as he looked at the front door, he realized it had been open this entire time. Lizaveta must have been so shocked that she didn't even close it behind her, and he hadn't thought to check the door at any point. What if someone had seen? Had someone seen? He hadn't had a view of the door while he was in the kitchen. What if someone had run off to find the police while he'd been standing there nitpicking over every drop of blood on the axe handle? At first, he closed the door, but then, realizing that the next step for him was to leave, he opened it a crack and listened. It was quiet for a brief moment until he heard the soft rhythm of someone climbing the stairs. They were far off at first, probably starting from the first floor, but they were calm and unhurried. But the lack of urgency only made Raskolnikov's mind panic even more. Were they coming up here? Would they stop on any of the floors below? He needed to know. But at the speed of the steps, it would take a long while before he could tell. His breathing grew heavy as he waited. He heard the steps reach the second floor, then the third, and they kept going. They were coming here. The only other apartment was unoccupied, so this visitor was here for the pawnbroker. He locked the door behind him and crouched next to it, forgetting to breathe. He could hear the stranger breathing heavily and in his own head assumed that it must be a big fat man. He squeezed the axe in one hand as the bell rang. The high-pitched rattle of the tin bell was like nails on a chalkboard to Rodion. He sat in silence while the guest waited for the lady of the house to open up. The bell rang again, but after a second's silence, instead of the comforting sound of footsteps headed down the stairs, his body shuddered at the sight of the doorknob jiggling violently as the man tried to open the door himself. Eyes wide, Raskolnikov stared helplessly. His mind couldn't process what was happening or what he would do if the man broke in. "Are they asleep or murdered?" he heard the thick voice say on the other side of the door. "Damn them," it said. "Alyona Ivanovna, you old witch. Lizaveta, my beauty, open the door. Oh, damn them. Are they asleep?" He tugged at the door handle several more times. Raskolnikov intuited that this man must know the sister as well to persist like this. Suddenly, he heard lighter steps coming up to the fourth floor and another voice. "There's no one home," the first voice said. "You don't say," the second man chimed in. The first said it appeared so, but it was strange because the old woman had set this time as an appointment for him to come, and this trip was out of his way, so it's not like he could just pop back in an hour. The young man cursed because he was also in need of some quick cash. The first man tugged once more before saying there was no point in hanging around. But the newcomer, who sounded like a younger man, maybe more educated, pointed out that when the man was tugging on the door, it shook. This meant it was not bolted shut from the exterior lock and key, but it was simply latched from the inside, meaning that at least one of them was definitely home. The large man shook the door furiously again. Raskolnikov was panting for breath as silently as he could. This was an absolute nightmare. No plan had accounted for this. After discussing what could be happening, the younger man says he's going to run and get the porter because something is off here. He tells the larger man to stay there. There are fast steps on the stairs as the young man descends again. There was a shuffling of feet from the larger man just across the door from Raskolnikov. But after 2 minutes of agonizing nothingness, the larger man, whose name we learn is Coke, but we never really see him again, so it's barely worth mentioning, he gets impatient waiting and decides to go see what's taking the other man so long in fetching the porter. He felt annoyed at having been left on sentry duty. Raskolnikov's hopes slowly returned as he heard the footsteps of the heavy man slowly descend to the third floor and then the second and to the ground floor. He silently opened the door, shut it behind him, and began to descend the stairs. He was on the third floor when he heard voices below him yelling. One said, "Hey there, catch the brute!" He then heard fast steps dashing down from the apartment below. "Mitka," the voice yelled, "Mitka, blast him!" He heard arguing carrying on as another set of footsteps left the second floor running for the ground, but he wasn't in the clear because he heard the voices of several men talking, beginning to go up the stairs. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run. As he filled with despair, he realized the only shot he had was to try and act natural and consider the chance that they would not accost a casual-looking man in passing. If he was caught standing still or running down the stairs looking panicked, they'd nab him for sure. So he kept descending, and he made it to the second floor where deliverance was at hand. There was an open door to the flat where the painters had been, but there was no sign of anyone inside. Perhaps they were the ones who had been yelling at each other earlier. So he ducked in the apartment and hid out of sight as he listened to the group of men continue up the stairs where they were about to find 2 dead women in a matter of seconds. He knew as soon as they discovered the locked door was now unlocked that they would realize the perpetrator had been close by and would begin to search, so he had to move quickly without drawing attention to himself. He made it outside and noticed there was a crowd gathering around some commotion in the street, but he walked as casually as he could until he made it around the corner 100 yards from the apartment building. The farther he walked, the more his body wanted to give up. He was exhausted, and his mind could barely process his journey home. When he made it back to the building, he placed the axe back in the porter's shed, climbed the stairs once more up to his closet space, and he flung himself on the sofa. His nerves were completely shot, and his mind raced unintelligibly. He simply existed in a state between rest and consciousness, unable to think clearly, unable to go to sleep. Ugh. If you were like me going into this book, you probably didn't expect the atrocity to be this early on. But nope, this is not about building up to a crime. It's about a crime happening and the fallout that comes afterwards. And to just have, I don't know if I'd call it lighter, but it's definitely lighter than reading that chapter. A little side note, did you know there was a real-life murder that helped inspire this story of Raskolnikov? In 1830s France, there was a man named Pierre-François Lacenaire. He was educated, he was a poet, and he was very well-spoken. Someone who belonged in cafes and salons, not in a courtroom. And so Lacenaire, it turns out, was not a murderer first, he was a burglar. And he had an accomplice who would break into places with him to rob very wealthy people. And one night, they were robbing the apartment of a man named Chardon. Robbing this man was not very symbolic of a choice, it was just money. But they were discovered, and in the moment, Lacenaire made a cold decision. He killed the man, and then he killed his son. Not so much out of panic, but he did not want to leave witnesses. You should start to see the parallels between the two stories at this point. But what's so curious is afterwards, Lacenaire didn't plead madness or beg forgiveness, but he wrote from prison, and he claimed that he was at war with society, not by instinct, but by reflection. He argued that his crime was chosen and rational. He even said that remorse was just a prejudice invented by people too weak to act. That was what shocked everybody. Not so much the murder, but the idea that an intelligent and well-educated man could kill and calmly defend it. You can feel Dostoevsky pulling on this with Raskolnikov, the belief that intellect might justify your deeds. Lacenaire built a philosophy around the act in order to survive it. Raskolnikov builds one before to justify his crossing the line. After what felt like an eternity of paranoia before finally losing consciousness, he woke up to realize it was after 2 p.m. the next day. His mind flooded with the memories of the previous night, each realization a thought he wished he could bury and not have to accept as reality. Poor Lizaveta, she was never supposed to be caught up in this. In fact, he had seen his intended crime as a way of freeing her. He could have found a way to financially support her with the spoils, but now she was dead at his hand, and in his panic and revulsion, he hadn't even gotten away with much. He had a leather purse that he'd taken off of Aliona's body and a couple of handfuls of gold jewelry from the lockbox, but that was not enough to start a new empire of generosity with. His body shook, his teeth chattered. It wasn't cold that day by any means. He was just ill. His body was revolting. And after staring at the ceiling for long enough, he realized he still had the things he'd stolen shoved in his pockets. He already had a plan for where to stash them in the short term. One of the corners of his room had a hole in the wall that had just enough space behind it for him to hide the purse and the jewelry and then cover up the hole, making it unnoticeable. This was a short-term strategy. But then he realized that although he had managed to not be covered in blood, he did have traces of it on his pants and sleeves and his socks. He stripped down and washed the blood out as best as he could. The advantages of wearing what other people would consider rags is that you can just rip off a blood-stained portion of your pants and people won't think you more impoverished than you already were. So he removed what he could not clean, and then laid down for 5 more minutes before bolting up, realizing the noose was still in his coat. That was evidence. He jumped up and ripped the stitches out of the cloth loop. His body was weak, his mind unfocused. He was the complete opposite of who he had convinced himself he was in order to be capable of something like this. "Surely it isn't beginning already," he said. "Surely it isn't my punishment coming upon me, is it?" By the way, there's a reason why people can seem calm, even convinced going into something like committing a murder, and then unless they are literally a psychopath, they absolutely unravel afterwards. And it explains exactly why Raskolnikov gets sick almost immediately. It's called perpetrator-induced traumatic stress, or PITS for short. But the core idea is much older than medical science, and it's much simpler. It's that humans are not wired to kill members of their own group. We kill animals constantly, and most of us have no psychological collapse when that happens because we don't perceive them as moral equals. They don't activate the same social and emotional circuitry that killing another human does. It lights up empathy systems, mirror neurons, shame and disgust responses, networks that evolved specifically to prevent in-group killing. Because any society that normalized killing of its own people did not survive very long. So when someone crosses that line, the body doesn't wait for a moral debate to take place. It reacts immediately with nausea, maybe fever, confusion, disassociation. It may be different for anybody, but it's a kind of physical rejection. The nervous system is basically saying, hey, this action doesn't fit inside what a human is built to do, so stop that. That's why Raskolnikov collapses before he's even worried about being caught. His theory is still intact. His logic hasn't failed yet, but his body has already vetoed what he's done. And this is where Dostoevsky is kind of terrifyingly ahead of his time, because he doesn't refute Raskolnikov's argument with counter-arguments. He lets biology interrupt him. The novel is quietly saying, you don't need religion or law to punish this idea. Your nervous system will do it for you. And what's interesting here is that the reaction isn't just fear. Research shows it's more strongly tied to moral injury, to becoming something you can't psychologically integrate than it is to fear of consequences. Even people who believe the killing was justified may still show these symptoms, which leads to the uncomfortable conclusion that it feels like Dostoevsky is circling, which is you can reason your way into murder, but you can't reason your way out of how you will feel about it afterwards. That's why Raskolnikov doesn't spiral intellectually first. He's disintegrating physically before our eyes. And while he was spiraling about what other evidences might be findable, Nastasia knocked on the door loudly. She was talking to someone. Apparently she'd tried knocking before, but he hadn't responded. Raskolnikov jumped up, trying to put an innocent face on, and opened his door to find the maid standing there with the porter, who had an envelope in his hand. It was a summons from the police. It didn't say what it was for. It just said he had to report at the station. The porter turned and left, and the maid said something about how it was obvious the poor boy was ill. Raskolnikov just stood there, not moving, barely breathing. It couldn't be. They couldn't have identified him this quickly, could they? No, of course not. If they suspected him of murder, they wouldn't send a summons. They'd send 6 policemen. But the timing seemed impossible. Not even 24 hours had gone by since he'd killed 2 women with an axe, and for the first time in his life, he was being summoned to the police station? His lip quivered, but Nastasia assumed it was just stress from being ordered to do something when he felt so poorly. She told him he should ignore it, that she'll send word that he's ill and he'll come when he's able. He can barely utter a few words to tell Nastasia that he will go, and she leaves him alone. He starts to put on his clothes, noticing the bits of blood that would not be noticeable unless you knew where to look, but all he could think of was that he was about to enter the police station with the blood of his victims still on him. He knelt at one moment to pray, something he didn't have a habit of doing, but he shortly began to laugh. Not at the idea of praying, but at himself. If I'm lost, I am lost. I don't care. His emotions fluctuated between despair and haphazard laughter as if daring the fates. He entered the hot, dusty street, which only compounded his feelings of illness, but he still managed to have a crazed smile on his face, like a man walking to the gallows who doesn't fear death. If they question me, maybe I'll just tell them what happened, he thought as he weaved between the people in the street. He entered the building and climbed the stairs to the floor where he'd been summoned to. half convinced that he wouldn't even wait to be questioned, but he would just enter and confess. But the lobby was busy and loud, and there was a long line, but he didn't feel like waiting all that time, so he walked to the front and inquired about his summons. The clerk, who looked overwhelmed at the moment, ignored him until Raskolnikov made his presence known, and he handed the clerk his summons. Raskolnikov half expected the man to stop everything he was doing and say, "Here he is, boys, the murderer just walked in on his own." He knew that wouldn't be the case, and yet, again, the sheer insanity of being called here the day after he'd murdered. What could it be for? The clerk just looked at the summons and said, "Oh, yes, you're the student," and flung some papers at him. "For the recovery of money due," he said. "Money?" Raskolnikov sputtered. His confusion was outweighed by his relief, so this was not about the pawnbroker's death at all. Behind the clerk was an assistant superintendent who, looking over Raskolnikov's summons, haughtily said that the summons was for 9 a.m. and it was now past 12. Raskolnikov's righteous indignation returned now that he knew this was not about the murders. He'd always been quick to fly off the handle if he felt he was being treated poorly, and the fact that he wore rags was almost as if he was daring people to treat him like a pauper so he could get into an argument with them. So he yells at the superintendent that the notice had only been delivered to him 15 minutes ago and that he had come down here despite being sick. "Refrain from shouting," the policeman said. "You're the one shouting at me," Raskolnikov snapped back. The two of them go back and forth until the clerk cut in by handing another document to Rodion. It was an IOU agreement requiring him to make a declaration that he would either pay it or that he would give a date which he could pay by, and also agree to not leave the capital until the debt was paid. It was from his landlady. So that's what this is all about. She'd finally gotten fed up with him for not paying, but rather than feeling the weight of the financial obligation in this moment, he felt joy. It wasn't a choice to be happy, it was instinctual, just a response to realizing that no one was on to him or what he'd done the other night. Another higher-ranking officer came into the room and began speaking to Raskolnikov about the superintendent, whose name is Ilya Petrovich, who the officer, who was named Nikodim Fomich, claimed was a brilliant soldier in his time, but he had a hot temper. He was even known as the explosive lieutenant. Once order had been restored, Raskolnikov asked permission to explain himself to Captain Nikodim Fomich, and he tells him how, when he first moved into the place several years ago, he had promised to marry the landlady's daughter. He admits he didn't really love the girl, but he did like her, and the mother was basically content to not charge rent to her future son-in-law. But then, a year ago, the girl died of typhus. I remained lodged there as before, and when my landlady moved into her present quarters, she said to me, and in a friendly way, that she had complete trust in me, but still, would I not give her an IOU for 115 rubles, all the debt that I owed her. She said if I only gave her that, she would trust me again as much as I liked, and that she would never, those were her words, make use of that IOU till I could pay it myself. And now, when I have lost my lessons and have nothing to eat, she takes action against me. What am I to say to that? The policemen basically say, that's too bad. You still have to write a declaration of repayment. So he took up the pen, but he was barely able to write. He was so sick. He wrote in heavy, drawn-out strokes, but his mind wandered as he heard the captain and the superintendent step aside to discuss a different matter. It's impossible. They'll both be released. To begin with, the whole story contradicts itself. Why should they have called the porter if it had been their doing? To inform against themselves? Or as a blind? No, that would be too cunning. Besides, Pestryakov, the student, was seen at the gate by both the porters and a woman as he went in. He was walking with 3 friends who left him only at the gate, and he asked the porters to direct him in the presence of his friends. Now, would he have asked his way if he was going with such an object? And as for Coke, he spent half an hour at the silversmith's below before he went up to the old woman, and he left him at exactly 7:45. The other broke in. But how do you explain this contradiction? They say that when they knocked, the door was locked, yet 3 minutes later, when they went up with the porter, it turned out the door was unfastened. That's just it. The murderer must have been there and bolted himself in, and they'd have caught him for a certainty if Coke had not been an ass and gone to look for the porter too. He must have seized the interval to get downstairs and slip by them somehow. Coke keeps crossing himself and saying, "If I had been there, he would have jumped out and killed me with his axe." Raskolnikov neither felt fear or cleverness as he listened to these details of his crime being discussed in the police station. He felt nothing. He finished his contract and turned to head for the door, but he didn't make it. He regained consciousness on the floor With people propping him up as Nikodym Fomitch, the captain, stood over him, saying, "What's this? Are you ill?" The clerk noted that Raskolnikov had barely been able to hold the pen as he was writing. The mean superintendent, rather than feeling pity, began a hard line of questioning. "How long have you been ill? Did you go out while you were sick? What time? Where?" Fomitch interrupted mercifully, and once Raskolnikov could get to his feet, he was free to go. But now he did feel that familiar sensation of terror again as he stumbled his way back home. If he were an innocent man, he would have gone home and crashed on the couch again until he got some sleep. But Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov was not an innocent man. His thoughts immediately went to getting rid of the evidence. He had to get the gold and the purse out of his room. He shoved everything into his pockets and walked into a more isolated part of town. He entered a work yard where there was no one around, and he noted a large rock in the corner of the yard, large enough to conceal the goods. With what little strength his punished body could muster, he lifted the stone. There was already a decent amount of space underneath it, enough to shove the stolen items in and then lower the rock without fear of it crushing the valuables. As soon as he left the yard and was back on the street, the feeling of joy returned again. "I have buried my tracks," he thought to himself. "Who would think to look for a murdered woman's treasure under a random stone in a random part of town? Even if it is found, there are no ties to me. It is all over." He smiled as he stumbled through the streets. But he didn't head straight home. He wandered aimlessly in thought until he looked up and realized he had arrived at the house of his friend Razumihin without realizing. Remember the school friend he had almost gone to visit the day before? He climbed up the 5 flights to his friend's garret. You can imagine how much labor that would be based on how sick he is. And he knocked, waited for the door to open, and considered how long it had been since they'd seen each other. 3 months? No, it had to be at least 4. Razumihin opened the door in slippers and a dressing gown, unshaven and hair all over the place. His face beamed at the sight of his friend. "Is it you?" he cried, but quickly he noticed how unwell Raskolnikov was, and he invited him to sit down. Rodion started talking incoherently about how he was looking for lessons, but he doesn't really want to teach lessons. His friend said he seemed delirious. Inside his own head, Raskolnikov realized that this had been a huge mistake. He was in no condition to enter into a lengthy conversation with anyone right now, least of all a friend who would have plenty of questions for him. He got up to leave, but Razumihin, who, I used to do this at the beginning of the show, but I haven't done it for a long time, but I'm just going to call Razumihin Raz for short, because Raskolnikov is already a long enough name to have to say repeatedly, and Razumihin, he just seems like the kind of guy who would go by a shortened version of his name. So he's our guy Raz for the most part. And so Raskolnikov got up to leave, but Raz is quick to explain that he does actually have work for him as it happens. He has taken up plenty of work recently as a translator, and it pays pretty well, much better than teaching lessons. He already has a backlog of books needing translation, so there's plenty of money for both of them. Rodion looked at some pages that Raz had held out to him for him to examine, and then without another word, he put them down and headed for the door. "Are you raving or what?" Razumihin said, completely baffled at what was going on with his friend. "I don't want translation work," he said. "Then what the devil do you want?" Raskolnikov just descended the stairs in silence. He'd spent so much of the past 24 hours fluctuating between feelings of terror and joy, but now he found himself in a third state, melancholy, less focused on if he was going to be caught and more focused on how the act had not provided him with what he had expected. He wasn't satisfied with the results. He hadn't even gotten away with enough money to make that much of a difference in the life that he dreamed to have. What had it all been for? The chapter ends with a scene that he ultimately finds out is a dream. He dreamt that his landlady was being viciously beaten by that mean superintendent, Ilya Petrovich. I don't feel the need to present the dream in full because it doesn't have any bearing on the rest of the story other than to show that Raskolnikov clearly does not have a mind at peace in this moment. After the dream, he drank some water to calm his nerves and then sunk into complete blackness. He's out for a long time with his fever. He has moments where he thinks he's conscious of things going on, but he can't tell if they're just dreams before he drifts off again. When he finally does kind of wake up, he finds Nastasia, Razumihin, and some messenger in the room. It turns out the messenger needed a signature to deliver 35 rubles that his mother had sent him. Raskolnikov tries to reject the money, knowing what a burden it was for his mother and not wanting to be more in her debt. But he isn't really intelligibly able to reject it, so Raz, who is only concerned with the impoverished state of his friend, gets him to sign for the money. In this brief moment of wakefulness, Raz explains that he's had his doctor friend, Zosimov, stop in to check on him, and the doctor said that this illness would pass. Our first impression of Razumihin is of what a good friend he is. After that brief encounter of madness in his own flat, he knew something was wrong with his friend. So he hunted down where he lived and took it upon himself to make sure this friend got better. It turns out that Raz has been getting chummy with the landlady as well because he knows all about the IOU and the engagement to her daughter. He thinks he's even figured out enough about her to get her to back off of Rodion's case, for now. He even convinced her to get rid of the IOU, saying that Raskolnikov had promised that his mother would settle the debt, which only made Rodion feel guilty for ever having said that, knowing that his mother was barely less of a beggar than he was. But Razumihin was pleased with himself. He hands the note of debt that he had received from the landlady to his friend, free to destroy it. But Raskolnikov just rolled over on his couch to stare at the wall. Raz is feeling disrespected for all of the effort he's gone to, being disregarded, but he's not deterred from helping his friend. Raz is a very social creature and doesn't have the greatest sense of personal boundaries, is maybe how to put it, because we then learned that he had invited Zamyatov over while Raskolnikov had been out. Now, you haven't heard that name before, but he was the clerk at the police station, and apparently he was friends with Razumihin. And so while Zamyatov had been visiting, apparently Raskolnikov had been speaking in a delirium. Upon hearing this, Rodion gets very concerned and asks what he had been raving about. Razumihin laughs at him, saying he didn't confess any secrets if that's what he's worried about. He said something about a bulldog and earrings and chains and a porter. He named the police captain and superintendent. "Oh," he then said, remembering, "then you kept demanding your sock. Give me my sock," you kept saying. The sock was one of the items with a more noticeable bloodstain, by the way. Raz closes up his accounts of what's been happening while his friend was out, telling him that he's taking 10 of the 35 rubles his mother sent, and he'll be back in a few hours. He's going to do some good with it. Raskolnikov was crazed with doubt now. A cop had been in his home? Did they know? Was this all just a coincidence, or was he like some bug under a glass for observation, not being arrested but keeping a close watch on him? For a moment, he considers taking the 25 rubles and just finding a new place to live where he won't be so easily observed. He considers going to America. Then he gets so worked up that he finally overdoes it and falls back asleep on the couch. He wakes up hours later to Razumihin back in the room with a big grin on his face. He'd taken the 10 rubles and bought his friend a complete new outfit so he doesn't have to walk around in rags. A cap, pants, waistcoat, several shirts, and boots. None of it was brand new stuff, but it was quality and gently worn. He hands over 50 kopecks in change that hadn't been spent on the clothes, and Razumihin says he wants Raskolnikov to try it on, but Rodion says he doesn't want to. He's not pleased with his friend spending his money like this without his approval. As they continued arguing about the clothes, the door to his room opened, and a tall, stout man who Raskolnikov kind of recognized came inside. So I have a quick confession to make. This is not my first time reading Crime and Punishment. The story goes that in my junior year of high school, I was in a concurrent enrollment literature class. Basically means I was getting college credit for high school courses, if you're not familiar. But I don't remember much from that class, except for reading several horror short stories, including The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe, which is one I covered in an episode for paid subscribers. The only other memory I have from that class is a group project, but it was a self-selecting group project. The teacher presented 4 to 6 books and let us read summaries of them, and then we got to choose which book most interested us, and whoever else chose that book, that was your group. I don't remember any of the other selections besides Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. Basically, none of them interested me. Whether it was truly not being engaged with the topics of the books, or if it was just my crippling need to feel like a unique little butterfly, I asked the teacher if I could do a different book, and she told me as long as I was fine being a group of 1, I could pick any book on the shelf behind her in the classroom. I glanced across the spines, finding several classics, probably multiple that I've covered on the show so far, but then my eyes landed on a battered copy of Crime and Punishment, and I smiled devilishly. This book had everything to my young mind. It had crime, it supposedly had the punishment of said crime, it was moody and Russian, plus it was more than 2 times as long as any of the other books. This was the one. Again, how much of the choice was purely interest in the book, and how much of it was wanting to show off to my classmates by doing a much harder book alone because I wanted to read real literature, I can't ever fully estimate. All I know is I was so surprised when the alluded to crime in the book happened so fast. I was not prepared for how depressing the main character would be. I was fascinated by the idea that you could fill hundreds of more pages with the aftermath of the crime. I had all these feelings and excitement, and yet I think it's safe to say we are now deeper into the book than I made it. I remember reading the murder, but I don't think I really made it any more beyond that, because life just came at me fast as a high school student, whether it was sports or dates or any of the other things a high school boy is far more interested in. It kept me from keeping up with the grueling pace I would have had to do to pull off this much larger book in the small time frame. Plus, imagine comparing something like Into Thin Air to Crime and Punishment regarding the thematic weight you have to wade through. I'm not trying to take shots at Krakauer here. It's the only book I could remember, but come on. We're talking about Dostoevsky, and my 17-year-old brain was just not ready for it. So like any enterprising young student did back at that time before smartphones, literally the same year that YouTube launched, I bought the Cliff's Note for the book. There just weren't the same amount of resources available to understand a book short of reading it, except for the classic old Cliff's Note. So that was my only option. I passed the project. My teacher probably knew, let's be honest. So I misled you when I said I've read the book before, because yes, I have read Crime and Punishment, but this was my first time finishing it. And I'll be honest, I don't think 17-year-old Jameson would have managed to handle Dostoevsky at that stage of life, so it's probably for the best. Raz brings his doctor friend Zasimov, again, I apologize for my Russian pronunciations, over to check on Raskolnikov again, who is positively irritated by all this attention. He wants nothing more than to be alone despite his illness, and anytime anyone is around, he can't help but be on guard. He's curious if they are secretly onto him, so solitude was his only peace. The doctor checked on him while Razumihin kept on about one thing or another. It was obvious that Zasimov and Raz were friends because they liked to have long conversations debating topics because it made both of them feel really smart. But Rodion only perked up once the two men started talking about the double murder that had recently happened. Nastasia, the maid, was hanging out there as well, and Raskolnikov rolled over so his facial expressions couldn't betray him as he just stared wide-eyed at the cracking yellow wallpaper, listening intently. They were discussing how the painters had been brought in for questioning and one of them had been accused. Zasimov seemed quite content with the explanation of how the painter would have done it, but Raz was disgusted by it, saying this was just another example of police not really knowing what happened and grasping at the most convenient out. Raz realizes that his friend had been laid up most of the time since the news broke, so he probably didn't even know about what had been in the papers. So he gives Rodion's backside a short version of the story as it's known to the public. He says he doesn't think it can be the painters because it's barely a stronger connection than the police's first accusation, which was Koch and Pestriakov, the two men who had tried to enter the door on their own. And as we listen to Raz speak, we can tell he's just one of those intelligent students who loves to point out how they are smarter than the institutions that they are a part of. He points out that the police have kept claiming they have the facts, but without sharing what the facts are, he's not convinced because, quote, at least half the business lies in how you interpret them. We now learn for the first time that the painters were hauled in because a couple days after the murder, one of them had gone to a tavern across the road from the house and asked the shop owner to give him 2 rubles for a small jeweler's case with gold earrings inside. When asked where he'd gotten them, he said he'd found them on the street. The shopkeeper knew Nikolai, the painter, because he came into his establishment often. So the day after the exchange with the jewelry, he asked Nikolai if he knew what had happened the other day in the house, just 2 stories above where he and his brother had been painting. Nikolai said no, but he looked shaken. He fumbled with his words and made a quick excuse to leave. That was when the shopkeeper decided the police should know. He was found and arrested after a woman stumbled across him attempting to hang himself. But her screams were so loud that he gave up the attempt and basically turned himself in. But when the questioning from the police got down to it, they learned that the confession he meant to make was not to say he'd killed the 2 women, but that the jewelry had been found in the apartment he was painting and not on the street like he'd said. He then relates a story that fills in the massive question of our timeline from Raskolnikov's point of view. He says that on the day of the murders, he had been busy painting all day long and was just wrapping up with his brother when, as a joke, his brother brushed his face with paint. He yelled at him, his brother took off down the stairs, and after a moment to wipe enough paint from his eyes, he took off after Dmitri, which is his brother's name. He recalls bumping into the porter and a few men at the base of the stairs, and then he caught his brother in the street and they started to fight. But playfully, eventually, he went back up to gather his supplies and he stepped on a package wrapped with paper that he had never seen in the corner of the room before. He opened it to find the jewelry. And this was his crime that he was so nervous about that he almost committed suicide. We, of course, hear all this through Razumihin, who's relaying it to the doctor and the maid, but at the mention of the jewelry being found behind the door, Raskolnikov spoke for the first time. "Behind the door?" he asked. "Lying behind the door?" He looked startled. "Yes," his friend said. "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing," Raskolnikov said as he settled back into his position of lying towards the wall. Nikolai claims to this day to know nothing of the murders and says he only avoided coming to the police out of fear that he would be named a suspect just for having pawned jewelry from the same house. And to his credit, this is exactly what's happening to him now. So Razumihin states his problem isn't with the police seeing the painter as a person of interest, but the fact that without further evidence of him being on the fourth floor when the two men were trying to get in, they took his story and put him close enough and are just assuming he is 100% guilty. The doctor feels like the fact that he lied about where the jewels were coming from was pretty condemning, but Razumihin puts it this way. He calls out his doctor friend, who is supposed to be a student of human nature, saying, "There are more than a dozen witnesses from the street who have sworn to seeing the two Painter brothers wrestling and fighting, pulling hair, squealing, laughing, all down in the street at the same moment that Koch, Pestryakov, the porter, and others found the two bodies of the murdered women. The bodies were still warm, meaning one or both of the brothers would have had to have killed the women and within minutes be down on the street in a good-natured wrestling match where they were seen by dozens of people. Does that sound like compatible evidence?" he said. "I don't care how smart or dumb a criminal you are, to make a public scene that IDs you in front of the building where a double homicide took place doesn't line up with a killer's instinct. The jewelry is nothing but circumstantial evidence." Zosimov says, "Well, if you've got it all figured out, how do you interpret the facts?" Raskolnikov then listened intently as his friend proceeds to clock exactly what had happened, from him hiding on the other side of the door to ducking into the painted apartment where the others climbed the stairs and dropping the parcel with the earrings while he was hiding, then to slip away while the crowd was busy watching the fight go on between the two painters. The doctor laughed at what he considered quite the wild theory because, in his words, it's too melodramatic. But Razumihin was scoffing at his friend while Raskolnikov was desperately trying to hold on to his breathing, which was no easy task as his heart was beating like a drum inside his chest as he listened to the details of his crime so perfectly be pegged by someone who wasn't even at the scene on that day. But before anything else happened, yet another person showed up at the door. This one was a stranger to everyone in the room. Now, if you haven't noticed, I picked up pretty quick on this theme that although it's by no means exclusive to Dostoevsky, he likes to end chapters with the arrival of someone new to the scene, promising a shift in the direction that we're going. But before we introduce who's up next, I just want to make sure you recall Raskolnikov's POV now that we know the painters, because you remember him listening intently after the large man Koch abandoned his post watching the door, but how on his way down the stairs he heard yelling, then one set of footsteps, and after a pause, another, before he heard the group start coming up the stairs. So the mysterious scuffs he'd heard were the two painters chasing each other before their public WWE match in the street. The next chapter opens with this line. "This was a gentleman no longer young, of a stiff and portly appearance and sour countenance." If that's how an author would describe you enter a room, you may want to take a deep look at yourself, is all I'm saying. The man looked disgusted to be there, and he looked at each face in the room with almost equal disapproval. Looking at the doctor, deciding he was the most respectable of the group, he addressed him, asking, "Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, a student or formerly a student?" Zosimov laughed and said Raskolnikov was the one on the couch, and Raz asked what the man wanted. Rodion slowly turned on the couch so he could see the visitor. "I'm Raskolnikov. What do you want?" he said grumpily. The man sneered in contempt for how unprofessionally everyone was treating him. "Pyotr Petrovich Luzhin," he said in introduction, "I have reason to hope that my name is not unknown to you." Raskolnikov didn't say anything in response. He just gazed stupidly at the man in disbelief. But after a moment, he folded his hands behind his head laying back on his couch, and stared at the ceiling. Mr. Luzhin seemed anxious and annoyed at the lack of an answer, but Raz invited the man to sit, explaining that Rodion had been sick for several days and this other man is a doctor checking in on him. Luzhin then returned his attention back to Rodion. "Your mamma led me to believe that she sent a letter explaining the whole of the situation a few days ago. Is that not right? But based on your lack of response, I wonder if you are not even aware." I know, Raskolnikov said sharply, then glancing at the man with a searching look as if purposefully showing that approval had not been given yet, he said, "So you are the fiancé?" That's all I need to know. Fyodor Petrovitch was visibly offended. He had assumed he was the gallant gentleman to this whole family and was not ready to be treated so coolly by the brother of his bride-to-be. As Raskolnikov looked him over, he saw a man who must have painted his whole life out to be picture perfect. He was now in his fiancé mode. He was wearing what were obviously all brand new clothes, perfectly tailored and fashionable, to the point where it stands out in a bad way that you are on trend. To his credit, his face looked younger than his 45 years, maybe because his hair was perfectly coiffed, as if he'd just come from the dressers to here. But after scanning Mr. Luzhin unceremoniously, Raskolnikov smiled malignantly, sank back on his pillow, and stared at the ceiling as before. Still trying to keep up his politeness, Mr. Luzhin expresses his sympathies about the illness and says if he'd known earlier he would have stopped by, but he's been so busy with all of his business things. He says the young man's mother and sister should be arriving any minute and that he's arranged for their apartment. "Where?" Raskolnikov asked. "Near here, in Bakalayev's house." Razumihin chipped in saying he knew the place, that it was filthy and stinking and the landlord was a doubtable character. A lot of stories of odd folks doing shady things that come from there. "But," he said in an almost mocking tone, "it is cheap, though." Luzhin claimed ignorance to any of that, saying that he is new to Petersburg himself and that he simply was looking for a place close to Rodion. He claims their rooms are clean and that it's a short-term arrangement anyway. He has already found his permanent housing in the city where he and Dunya will live after they are married. It's being renovated at the moment, which is why he is staying in a cramped place with his friend Andrei Semyonovich Lebezyetnikov. Now, that name has actually been mentioned before. I doubt you'll remember where. And when I do bring him back up, you'll be surprised at the connection, but I'll explain all of that later on. The only hint of this we get is that Raskolnikov repeats the name Lebezyetnikov as if he is also semi-familiar with it. Pyotr Petrovitch expresses almost an excitement at being back in Petersburg after 10 years of not visiting. Keep in mind, he's almost 20 years older than anyone else in the room. And he says how he likes the big cities because he likes to talk to those younger minds, to learn about the ideas they have, but almost immediately Raz starts to debate the man's claims, whether he did so because he could just tell that his friend didn't like him, so he's taking sides, or if it was just because he liked the sport of debating, we can't tell. So Raskolnikov listens in silence to the back and forth until he finds a moment to make a jab at his potential brother-in-law. He did so in a way that got Luzhin a bit more on edge, which delighted Rodion. And after a lengthy back and forth between Luzhin and Razumihin, it's obvious to the older man that the younger guy didn't like a wealthy middle-aged man claiming he understood the struggles of the young and the poor, and it seemed that Raskolnikov also didn't like him for unknown reasons. Again, he wasn't expecting this type of behavior because he was marrying the boy's sister, which would lift them out of their poverty. Wasn't that enough to receive some gratitude? And instead, he only got cold remarks and snide laughs from this insolent boy. Eventually, the conversation between Razumihin and the doctor Zasimov returned to theories about the murder. We learn that there is an investigator, Porfiry, who, of course, Razumihin is a distant relative to because he's connected to everybody in this story. But apparently Porfiry has been assigned the case, and he is supposedly meeting with everyone who had a pledge with the old woman. Once more, at this mention, Raskolnikov responded sharply to that statement, even though he had been uninterested in everything else that had been said. Razumihin was in the middle of an impassioned monologue about how this crime was not of some experienced criminal, but of a first-timer, someone convinced they could change their stars, and then found themselves capable of murder but not of robbery, because it was known they didn't get away with much, apparently. And once again, Raskolnikov listened on nervously to this spot-on description of his actions. At this point, Pyotr Petrovitch Luzhin inserted himself back into the convo, saying he had heard about the murder, and Razumihin asks if he knows the details. He says he does, but there is one larger question that he finds himself thinking about, and it's the fact that crime is on the rise with the wealthy these days. In Moscow, a forging ring had been discovered that was headed up by a university professor. There were a lot of other stories of high-class people faking banknotes, robbing their neighbors, And in this case, well, no truly poor people have gold to pawn in the first place. What is coming of society, he asked. But at this point, Rodion was worked up, and he was ready to bring home the finishing blow to express his hatred of this man. And is it not true, he asked, that within an hour of my sister accepting your proposal, you said that what pleased you most was that she was a beggar, because it was better to raise a wife from poverty so you may have complete control over her? His lips quivered as he waited for the reply. Luzhin acted scandalized. Upon my word, to distort my words in such a way, whatever your mother wrote you, it was not founded in truth. My intent was grossly misinterpreted. You see, What he says next is not a great response, and he tries to blame Raskolnikov's mother for having a way of taking things differently from how they were intended. You can guess how that went over with her overprotective son. Both men were obviously agitated and emotional, and Raskolnikov says that if he ever hears Luzhin say another word about his mother, he'll send him flying down the stairs. Razumihin tried to intervene, but the damage was done. Luzhin bit his lip, and as he got up to leave, he said that he had spotted from the moment he walked in that Raskolnikov had something against him, but that he had been willing to give a sick man the benefit of the doubt. But after this, I am not ill, Raskolnikov cut in, driving home the point that his hatred was not only pure, but coherent. So much the worse, Luzhin began. Go to hell, Rodion said, cutting him off. Mr. Luzhin stormed off without saying goodbye to anyone in the room, and Razumihin was perplexed at his friend's behavior, but Raskolnikov was so worked up that he began to yell at everyone to just leave him alone, to get out of the room and stop tormenting him. Raz stared in a mixture of shock and hurt as the doctor gathered his things and told the others to come with him. On the stairs, he said it may be worse for Rodion's health if they keep trying to baby him because his anger won't help the healing process. He wishes that Pyotr Petrovich hadn't come over because that had clearly set the boy's condition back a few steps. But, he said in a low voice to Razumihin, did you notice that he takes no interest in anything anyone said except for when the murder is mentioned? Okay, one quick note about Dostoevsky that I want to put you onto now so you can pay attention to it through the rest of the story, or as you read Dostoevsky on your own. One way I've heard it put about how Dostoevsky is so good is that he is excellent at portraying very different viewpoints honestly and to the best of his ability. And he shows how those different viewpoints and lifestyles interact with each other, not in judgment of one being better than the others, but just with a curiosity of how they play together, essentially. Specifically, he avoids using what is called a straw man argument, where you pit one belief against the other while offering a very weak version of one so it clearly looks worse than the other. The straw man argument is one of the logical fallacies that you're taught when you learn rhetoric and debate and things like that. Because if I said, I believe eating too much sugar contributes to a lot of our modern health issues, and someone responded to that saying, oh, so you're saying we should just never eat sugar and live a miserable life eating nothing but lettuce? That's a straw man. I never said don't eat sugar. I never said to only eat lettuce. You took my argument and made a very unrealistic version of it to make it less appealing so my claim would look insane. An argument like that doesn't hold up too much because, it's like a man made of straw. Now, the problem is that straw man arguments are very common these days, especially in politics, but even in many forms of storytelling, because it's a lot easier to make our heroes look heroic if the villains they fight have terrible reasons for what they're doing. It's easy to cheer against someone when their ideas aren't even being portrayed honestly and accurately. The real problem with that isn't just that it causes a lot of arguments and tribal behavior. It's just not reflective of real life. Life is messy. There's always going to be partial overlap between differing POVs, but it's so much easier to make the opposing one just look like everything they stand for is bad and needs to be shut down. And this makes it harder for us to find the truths in anything other than what we already believe at this moment in time. So Dostoevsky's talent wasn't necessarily in just showing how many different viewpoints are true, but it's in not picking and choosing which ones he thought were true enough that they would be embodied by a heroic figure. He just puts a bunch of different ideas into a coliseum and lets them duke it out like gladiators. You want proof of that? Well, odds are most of you just listened to that chapter and came away from it thinking that Luzhin kind of sucks when he, despite his many flaws, was being pitted in that room against a serial killer. I think it took a lot of talent from Dostoevsky for us to take an entire novel premise with someone who needs to go to prison and still make us say, well, let's try to understand where he's coming from. There's a dozen different ways you could package this idea, but at the most basic level, it boils down to this. He was really good at showing different points of view as honestly and as positively as he could portray them, the way that someone who believes that point of view would portray it. No need to make one look bad just to pad how well we perceive another viewpoint that he's trying to convince us of. Okay, in this next chapter, a lot happens. Most of it individually is not that relevant, but collectively it shows us the state of Raskolnikov's fevered mind. So we'll touch on everything, but some of it will be at a higher level than others. As soon as he was alone, he put on his new clothes, stuffed the 25 rubles in his pocket, and hit the streets. It was almost 8 p.m. and the sun was on its way down. It was still stiflingly hot and muggy. So considering he was really sick at this point still, he was in terrible condition to be going out at all. But he was determined that, quote, all this must be ended today once and for all, immediately. He claimed he could not go back home unless it was resolved because he could not live like that. And no, he does not explicitly state what it is, although we can all take general guesses at it. Despite his condition, the fact that he hadn't been out in days made him eager to take it all in. The sights and sounds. He listened to a young girl sing along to an organ grinder. It was better than the opera to his ears. He walked through the Haymarket where he'd overheard Lizaveta make plans to be gone at 7 p.m. that fateful night. But he wasn't disturbed for very long because he found himself in front of a tavern flirting with the working girls out front. He grabbed a drink with one of them, but found himself getting too philosophical for that kind of evening. Quote, where is it I've read that someone condemned to death says or thinks an hour before his death that if he had to live on some high rock on such a narrow ledge that he'd only have room to stand and the ocean, everlasting darkness, everlasting solitude, everlasting tempest around him, if he had to remain standing on a square yard of space all his life, 1,000 years, eternity even, it were better to live so than to die at once. Only to live and live life, whatever it may be, how true it is. Good God, how true. Man is a vile creature, and vile is he who calls him vile for that. And so you can imagine if he's having thoughts like this, he's not really interested in hooking up with a girl that night. He goes into a tavern where he sees Zamyatov, the clerk policeman that Razumin was friends with, and Raskolnikov's mood and maybe arrogance levels, maybe insanity levels were so high that he decided to have some fun with the young officer. He sits next to him and starts talking about the murders. Zamyatov was, first of all, surprised to see the man out. Last he'd heard he was practically unconscious, but then he was just as confused at the general demeanor of the sickly, nervous man who had fainted in the police station just a few days ago. He tells Zamyatov that he came here looking for the papers over the last few days, desperately looking to read whatever he could about the murder case. And he proceeds to make Zamyatov sweat by saying the most peculiar things. Things that Raskolnikov could just kind of get away with because he could fall back on claiming he was ill and mentally unstable. He describes to Zamyatov the feeling of hiding behind the locked door holding an axe while the men tried to get in, and how he had briefly felt a desire to swear at them from behind the door. After he said this, he broke into a fit of nervous laughter. Zamyatov was disturbed. You're either mad or... He trailed off. Or what? Come on, say it, Raskolnikov pushed. Nothing, the officer said. It's all nonsense. After sitting in silence, they get into a debate of if people who commit crimes are truly criminals, or as Raskolnikov puts it, are they children and simpletons? And he goes on to mock the story of a counterfeit ring that had been going on and discovered lately. He points out how stupid some of the simpletons were for their choices. Then he describes in great detail how he would have carried out such a crime, the counterfeiting, not the double homicide. Zamyatov is more uncomfortable, but he tries to cover it with weak laughter, saying he believes even more experienced criminals are not above making desperate choices, and he brings the story of the murdered pawnbroker up again, pointing out how the criminal carried it out in daylight, but in his haste he didn't even make off with much. Rodion was put out by this criticism of his actions and challenged Zamyatov, saying, if he was so sloppy, why haven't they caught him yet? But they did catch him, the clerk said, referring to the painter, clearly. The cop had been explaining how classic it was for a thief to spend their new money so quickly that it stands out. And Rodion scoffs, saying, you really think someone would commit murder and then keep on drinking in the tavern across the street for days afterwards? Zamyatov says not everyone is as clever as Mr. Raskolnikov. And then, referring back to the detailed explanation of the counterfeiting crime, he asks Rodion to walk him through how he would have done the pawnbroker murder. After a pause, the temptation to flaunt his genius even more was too much. To dangle the truth in front of an actual member of the law enforcement, but to get away with it? Ha! He then proceeds to explain exactly where he hid what he did steal. Not the actual address, but the general environment, including the workyard and the large stone, and mentions that by leaving it there for 2 or 3 years until memory of the crime had faded, no one would ever find it, and by the time he dug it up, no one would know how to trace his wealth to a murder from years ago. "You are a madman," Zamyatov said with an almost approving laugh. "And what if it was I who murdered the old woman and Lizaveta?" Rodion said. He was intoxicated on power at this point. The ability to discuss his crimes openly because it was all in the name of theory was just too rich of a scenario. It was a form of gloating. The clerk stared wildly at him before he slowly smiled in disbelief. "Could it be?" he asked. Raskolnikov glared at him for a while before bursting out laughing, saying, "Be honest, you believed it for a second, didn't you?" The interaction with the clerk ended with Raskolnikov teasing him for being fooled into his false confession, and the cop claiming he'd never believed it for a moment. Raskolnikov pays for the drinks and leaves. Then we get a brief interaction with Raskolnikov where he actually bumps into Razumihin, who was hurrying home to a party he was throwing. He had invited Raskolnikov to it earlier, but was positive his friend would be too sick to come. So when he sees him out in the street, he's eager to drag him along, but Raskolnikov's mood had been soured by bumping into his friend. He treats him pretty rudely, saying things like, "Can't you see I don't want your charity? Why do you keep trying to help someone who obviously doesn't want help? Why did you even come find me when I first fell ill? Maybe I was glad to die. I may be sick, but I am also sick of you." He continued to lay into his friend until he was wheezing for breath. Razumihin looked at him hurt and still with a sense of knowing that his friend needed him. His first response was, "Well, go to hell then." But as Raskolnikov tried to walk away, he stopped him and let into his friend, stating that even in his attempts to push him away, he was not original. "You are so desperate to not feel like a human being." He was so angry at Rodion after having spent days looking after him to be treated this way. "You're a clever fellow, but you're a fool. If you weren't a fool, you'd come to my party tonight and take part of the human experience. But instead, you're going to wear out your boots in the dirty streets avoiding people." He continued to point out the flaws in Raskolnikov's attempts to be above it all and tells him he should come to the party. "I will not come," Rodion said as he turned and walked away. "I bet you will," his friend said as he shouted the address after him. And to show just what a great friend Razumihin is, after his own emotions quieted his head, he started remembering how the doctor had warned him about agitating Raskolnikov in this condition, and Razumihin begins to curse himself for having unloaded on a sick man. Rodion, meanwhile, had moved onto the bridge. I haven't really touched on the moments too heavily earlier on, but there have been several moments where he's found himself on this bridge that he likes, staring out over the water. And so he finds himself here at this point, standing in the middle, both elbows on the railing, just staring off into the water. His initial energy leaving his apartment had worn off at this point. He was tired and still sick, obviously. He was watching the last pinks of the sunset disappear as windows and houses started to light up more. He was near the point of swooning from his illness when something broke him from his melancholic state. A woman who had been standing near him on the bridge had just jumped off. Others on the bridge acted quickly to pull her from the water. One woman recognized the jumper and said that that woman had tried to hang herself previously and that she was vulnerable when she was drunk. While everyone else was busy gathering around the nearly drowned woman, Raskolnikov looked on apathetically. He was disgusted at this sight. "No, that's loathsome," he said. "Water isn't good enough. Nothing will come of it. What about the police office? Why hasn't Zamyatov gone there already?" "Very well," he mumbled as he began to walk in the direction of the station himself. The energy he'd started off with to make an end of it all was now gone. It was nothing but a complete sense of apathy for life that kept his feet moving towards the station. But then he almost felt surprised to realize his path from the bridge to the station took him right past the scene of the crime. Curiosity pulled him back up those stairs. It had been days since the murders, but there was a gloom that hung over the entire building. In his stupor, he slowly made it up to the 4th floor, where he found it busy. Much too busy for that time of day, in his opinion. There were a couple workmen hustling around doing different renovations. He was surprised. Why had he assumed he would find the apartment exactly as he'd left it? But there were no decorations, no furniture. There was even new wallpaper, white with lilac flowers. This annoyed him. The workmen were talking like men stuck on a job do, but the triviality of their topics also annoyed Raskolnikov. It was as if no murders had happened here. There was so much activity that neither of them noticed him at first. It was only when he walked over to the bedroom that one of the workmen asked what he wanted. Without answering, Raskolnikov walked back to the front door and pulled the doorbell multiple times. He was amused at how the exact sound had filled him with such terror just days before. Each time he pulled it, he felt a twinge of fear still, but it also made him feel satisfaction. "What do you want?" the workman repeated. After slowly acknowledging the man's presence, Rodion said he wanted to rent an apartment and was looking around. "Well, it's too late to be checking out spaces here. And where is the porter?" the workman said. "The floors have been washed, but will they be painted?" Raskolnikov asked, ignoring the man's question. "Is there no blood?" The workman was confused and a bit taken aback. "The old woman and her sister were murdered here, weren't they? Where is the blood?" The workman's eyebrows raised in suspicion. "Who are you?" "Who am I?" "Yes." "Come down to the station with me and I'll tell you." The workmen were frozen until the older one decided it would be best to just get out of the way from this weirdo, and he had the other clean up and get moving. "Very well," Raskolnikov said in a dreamlike state, and he started down the stairs. He found the porter outside, and the workmen were close behind him. The older one called out to the porter saying this man, pointing at Rodion, had been up there claiming he wanted an apartment, but he was asking about the blood. The workman then repeated all the other weird behavior, which left the porter frowning at Rodion. The sick young man proceeded to give his full name and address before the porter asked him what he was doing here. Raskolnikov just kept acting strangely in front of a larger crowd of people until they got riled up, saying this strange man should be taken to the police station immediately. Raskolnikov was tempting fate. If the crowd took him, he would go, no questions asked. Their agitated voices filled his ears as he tuned them out in a thoughtless void until everyone became silent at a loud sound followed by many screams down the street. Everyone, including Raskolnikov, walked down to investigate. There was a smile on his face. He had made up his mind. Once he knew what had happened, he would take himself to the station. It would all be over soon. Okay, yeah, that was a wild chapter, right? I remember reading the line at the bridge where he said, "Ugh, that's loathsome. Water isn't good enough," and realizing that he had been toying with taking his life. At first, I looked back at his interaction with Zamyatov and remembered how oftentimes someone gets kind of euphoric once they've made up their mind to end it, and I interpreted that interaction as him flirting with confession because what did he care? But as I studied the chapter more, I realized that suicide was not the only possible end goal as he left his apartment that night. It was one option. But going back to his own words, quote, "All this must be ended today once and for all," he could not go on living like that. And as evidenced by his flip-flopping between happiness, anger, cleverness, and melancholy, it's clear that his mind was not really that of a man who was at peace with a decision he'd made. He left his apartment knowing that he would have to kill himself or confess, but he just knew he could not keep going as he had been, and now we'll see how that plays out. As Raskolnikov approached the crowd, he could see an elegant carriage stopped in the middle of the road. He heard people expressing their horror at what they saw, but most of them just stood around doing nothing. He pushed his way to the front, where he saw a body lying limp. It had been run over by the carriage. The man's face was covered in blood, his skull was broken in multiple places. The coach driver was in shock, begging to know what he could have done. He claims he wasn't even driving fast, that the drunk had come out of nowhere, but didn't respond to the coachman's yells to watch out. He fell right under the horse's feet. The only two possibilities was that he was so drunk he couldn't comprehend what was being said, or he'd thrown himself there on purpose. The crowd corroborated the story, collectively removing any blame from the driver. Only a few people had actually approached the body, and Raskolnikov was one of them. A lantern was lowered down to the man's face. "I know him," was all Raskolnikov could say. It was Marmeladov, the drunk from the second chapter of the book, who bore his life story to Rodion. Remember, I said we weren't done with him, even though he'd already played his biggest part in the story. He was unconscious, but seemed to still be breathing. Rodion spoke to the police who had just arrived on site, saying he knew the man's address, it was just down the street, and he asked for a doctor to be sent there while he got officers to help him carry the body to the man's home. I think most of us would agree nowadays that someone with severe head trauma should not be moved, but this was the 1800s, and Raskolnikov was a law student, not a med student. But the cops were just glad that someone had a plan that was better than stand here and keep the crowd from getting out of hand. He really was less than 50 yards away from his front door, so it wasn't much of a trip. When they entered the hallway room that his family lived in, Katerina Ivanovna had been busy scolding her kids through her tuberculosis coughs, and was surprised when there was a commotion coming up her stairs. And then she saw a group of men carrying what was the right size and shape to be her husband, but she couldn't distinguish his face from all the blood and swelling. They put him on a sofa. His wife turned white and gasped for air. The little children shrieked in fear. Rodion ran to Katerina Ivanovna's side and explained what had happened, reassuring her a doctor was on the way and telling her that he will pay the expenses, that she shouldn't worry. She rushed to her husband's side. She bit down on her lip to keep the screams from coming out. She grabbed a basin of water that she had been using to wash clothes and began to wash the blood and grime off her husband's broken face. Her breathing pained, but she composed herself in this moment of crisis. She asked the oldest of her daughters, Polenka, which, from what I can tell, she's probably about 11 or so, to go fetch Sonia, telling her to run her fastest. Crowds were forming at each of the doorways to their hallway habitat. People were talking, whispering, some laughing. This sent Katerina into a fury. "You might let him die in peace at least. Is it a spectacle for you to gape at? With cigarettes?" She choked on her coughs. The landlady comes and is trying to order them to take Marmeladov to the hospital, less to care for him and more because she didn't want a dying man bleeding all over her house. Katerina gets into a fight with the landlady, and Marmeladov finally spoke for the first time. All he said was, "A priest." He said it several times, and he was informed that one was already on the way. He looked through his bloodied eyes at his 3 little stepchildren. The children were cowering in fear. He had been a terrible father to them, in terms of negligence, but he had held a simple and pure love for them. When the doctor arrived, Raskolnikov took point on working with him since Katerina was busy managing her own emotions as well as those of her children. The doctor looked over the body. His shirt had been removed for examination. He immediately saw that several ribs were broken and there was a horse hoof-sized black bruise just over his heart. The doctor consults with Raskolnikov, saying there's nothing that can be done. He will be dead in minutes. As they talked, the priest arrived and was sent to Marmeladov's bedside. The priest offered confession, and Marmeladov mostly uttered words that couldn't be understood in his final act of penitence. But as the priest wrapped up the confession, Polenka returned with her stepsister Sonia. Sonia was heavily made up and dressed in her cheap but flashy dress that she used when she was working to lure men for cash. It clashed with the scene here, but no one said a word as she watched the priest kneel over her father. As the priest retreated, Katerina Ivanovna confronted the holy man, demanding to know what she is supposed to do with her little children. "God is merciful. Look to the Most High for succor," was the response. Through bitter tears, she said that God is merciful, but not to her. The priest tried to warn her that speaking this way was a sin. "And this isn't a sin?" she screamed, pointing at the dying man. "The only blessing of this happening," she said, "is that it's one less mouth to feed on their non-existent income." The priest did not want to get tangled up in this affair and only offered platitudes and hollow words of scripture. Katerina was in a frenzy as she begged the priest for help, or even just guidance. But Marmeladov's dying moments were spent staring at the agonized face of the wife he had made suffer due to his choices and his addictions for all those years. Even as she berated the priest, she was kneeling over her husband. He tried to speak. She knew he was trying to ask forgiveness, and she told him he didn't need to say it. She knew exactly what he wanted to tell her. His eyes roamed the room full of strangers until he saw his beloved Sonia crying in the doorway. He started pointing at her, struggling for breath. He tried to sit up. His wife pinned him down, but he managed to boost himself up onto an elbow. His eyes glared wildly at his daughter. He'd never seen her in her working clothes before, and it broke him. The level of denial he had lived in for years, knowing what she did for him, for the rest of the family, but convincing himself that it wasn't that great of a burden for her to bear. In his last moments, he truly had his reckoning, watching his humiliated daughter have to spend her last moments in his presence, signaling to all these people that she was part of a trade that marked her like a plague victim. "Sonia, daughter, forgive," he said, struggling to get the words out. He reached out for her, but lost his balance and fell to the floor. Sonia rushed to his side and held him for his last breaths. He died in her arms. The brand new widow wailed in a room full of onlookers. "What am I to do now?" Raskolnikov rushed over to her, explaining that he knew her now dead husband and how he knew the full story of his sins and shortcomings. He asked her to allow him to repay a debt to a dead friend, and he shoves the 20+ rubles that were in his pocket into her hands. He promises that he will come again to see how he can be of further assistance, saying goodbye, and heads for the door. On the stairs down, he runs into Police Captain Nikodim Fomich. Just remember he was there when Raskolnikov fainted. He was the good cop, not much more is needed to remember about him. And when Fomich asked about the blood on Raskolnikov's clothes, he explained how he'd been there to help carry the now dead man to his home. But he had barely made it out of the house when little 11-year-old Polenka came darting out, calling to him, asking to know his name and address. He put his hands on her shoulders and smiled as sympathetically as he knew how and asked who sent her. Her sister Sonia had, it turns out. He squatted down to meet her at eye level, and she reached her skinny arms around him in a hug, kissing him on the cheek. Then she buried her head in his shoulder and began to cry. He talks with her about her father, any fond memories she has of him. She told him how her father had taught her how to pray, and how she prayed daily not only for her biological father who was dead, but for Marmeladov as well. And at length he paused, looking her in the eyes, and said, "Polenka, my name is Rodion. Pray sometimes for me, too." She smiled at him and said she would pray for him the rest of her life. He gave her his address and promised to come visit the next day as she went back inside. As he turned back to the street, there was something in him, something stirring. Vigor, maybe, the best word to describe it? "Enough," he said triumphantly. "I'm done with fancies, imaginary terrors and phantoms. Life is real. Haven't I just lived it now? My life has not yet died with that old woman, the kingdom of heaven to her. And now enough, madam. Leave me in peace. Now for the reign of reason and light, and of will and of strength." And now, feeling invigorated for the first time in ages, he decided to go to Razumihin's party and let him win his bet. Pride and self-confidence grew continually stronger in him. He was becoming a different man every moment. What had happened to cause this revolution in him? He did not fully know. He suddenly felt that he too could live, and there would still be life for him, and his life had not died with the old woman. Perhaps he was in too great a hurry with his conclusions, but he did not think of that. Razumihin, who would have been overjoyed to see his friend no matter what, was just drunk enough for his elation to be multiplied, and to see what good spirits Rodion was in sent him over the edge. Raskolnikov basically just says, "You were right about everything, but I'm too weak to actually hang out at your party, so I'm going home." And his loyal friend says he'll walk him home. His uncle, by the way, this was like a housewarming party for Razumihin and his uncle who were moving in together, but he says his uncle will hold down the fort. And as they walked, Raz's drunkenness served as a passcode to get into his vault of secrets. And he says how happy he is to see that Raskolnikov is in such good spirits and clear-minded because he's been getting more and more worried about his friend's mental state, saying that Dr. Zasimov had warned him there was a higher and higher likelihood that he was just straight up losing his mind. And then he confesses that Zamyatov had relayed the story of his interaction in the pub with Raskolnikov, which only led to him being more worried about his friend's mental state. Razumihin assures him that he smoothed things over with Zamyatov, saying what a jokester his friend was and what a dark sense of humor he had. Rodion was high on life, and Razumihin was drunk on cheap liquor. They made quite the pair walking through the street at night. They arrived at Raskolnikov's home, and his friend wouldn't leave him until he saw him tucked in for the night. But as they climbed the stairs, they heard a woman's voice in his room. Nastasia? I mean, maybe, but she would know better than to hang out in his room alone. Plus, it was really late. She should be asleep. Raskolnikov flung the door open and saw sitting on his ratty little couch his mother and sister. They'd been there 90 minutes waiting for him to come home. He was dumbfounded. He'd forgotten they were coming. Seeing their son and brother, the two women rushed him, but he didn't move. His feet were planted. He couldn't even raise his arms to embrace them as they hugged and kissed him. It had been a few years since they'd seen him, just as a reminder. Razumihin stood there stupidly in the doorway watching this reunion. They took a guess at who this man was, because Nastasia had spent a while with them talking about the friend who had been watching over their sick family member. Raskolnikov's mother even called him a very competent young man. And this was yet another chapter that ended by introducing a character, or two in this case. The next bit can be summarized pretty quickly by saying that Raskolnikov's new positive attitude evaporated when he saw them. We don't get insight into his thoughts, but my best guess is that it's because seeing them rudely reminded him of the reality of the whole situation with Mr. Luzhin, which reminded him that even though he now has a newfound appreciation for life, he still doesn't have the financial means to save his family from having to make this terrible decision, and that soured him pretty darn quick. So he grabbed one of each of their hands with his and asked them to go home, that Razumihin would see them there safely. And now, on top of this rudeness of him showing up just to tell them to leave, his mother had been planning on spending the night with him to make sure he was okay. "Don't torture me," he exclaimed, which I don't know how many of you would have that response if your mom said she wanted to stay with you. The only way to convince his mother to leave was Razumihin stepped in and promised that he would drop them off at their ugly little rooms that cheapo Luzhin had put them in, and then he would return there to watch over Rodion through the night. Dunya, the sister, was quiet but quick to agree because she could see how agitated her brother was having to answer his mother's questions. But his mother was crying, saying that she hasn't seen her baby boy in 3 years. She just wants to look at him. He asks if Luzhin has been to see them and then feels like he should warn them that they've already met and he has threatened him. His mom was distressed to hear this, but he looked at his sister, who he was very close to back in the day and who he loved very dearly, and told her that he cannot let this marriage happen, and gives her a direct ultimatum. It's him or me. If you marry Pyotr Petrovich, you won't see me again. He shared how he knew she was marrying the man for his sake, so the only way to show how much he can't let that happen was to make it clear that if she marries Luzhin for Rodion's sake, she'll never see her dear Rodion again. Raz was trying to comfort the women by saying that Rodion was raving mad, which I just laughed to think of being in a situation where that would be the solace you give someone. Don't listen to him, he's crazy, at this very moment at least. But Raskolnikov at this point is getting used to having to explicitly state that the mean things he says were said with a clear conscience, because he tells Dunya that even if it makes him a scoundrel, he won't let this marriage take place. And with that, he finally collapsed on the sofa, exhausted. Dunya looked at this Razumihin with interested eyes. He flushed at her gaze. But the friend promises it'll be better if they leave, and that after he drops them off, he will grab his doctor friend to look at Rodion again, and then he personally will come and report on the doctor's findings. The last half hour have sobered up Razumihin considerably, and he did everything he could to get the desperate Pulcheria Alexandrovna, that's his mom's name, to just go back to her lodgings and let him look after her son. You can both sympathize with the mom who is beside herself to have traveled all this way to see her son only to be told to leave him, but if you're Razumihin, you also know that it's not worth agitating the man. He's enough of a headache when he's not livid. So he takes them back and clearly is developing a crush on Dunya in record time, which you can't blame him. She's beautiful, elegant beyond her social standing, and has eyes that made him feel like he was being clued into the meaning of the universe. So he, of course, says a few things he regrets in his still somewhat drunken state about what a scoundrel Luzhin is, but he promises to fetch the doctor and let them know how Rodion is doing. And in this spacey state of his, he ends up saying one of the most profound lines of the book. He was apologizing for his drunkenness, explaining it as a response to getting into arguments with some very annoying guests at his party. But then he forgives them for their obstinate opinions, saying, quote, "To go wrong in one's own way is better than to go right in someone else's. In the first case, you are a man. In the second, you're no better than a bird." When he leaves the women in their rooms, Pulcheria Alexandrovna comments to her daughter about what a competent and devoted young man this Razumihin is. Dunya warmly replied that he did indeed seem like a splendid person. An hour later, Raz was back with the doctor, who assured them that the agitation was part of his symptoms and that Rodion just needed rest and should not be fired up. His mom asked about the claims that he was going insane, and the doctor assured her those were exaggerated. And after saying goodnight, the two men went back to the house where Raskolnikov lives and spent the night sleeping in odd corners of the house so they could be close by without actually being in his line of sight, where he might get angry with them. The next morning, Razumihin was regretting the things he'd said while drunk, feeling ashamed for insulting the fair woman's fiancé to her face. But he had told them he'd come back in the morning to check on them. And when he gets there, Mama Raskolnikov is stressed out. They've received a letter from Luzhin welcoming them to Petersburg and saying he wants to meet with them, but there was a condition. I'll actually just share the entire letter because it shows how condescending and pretentious Luzhin is. "Dear Madam Pulcheria Alexandrovna, I have the honor to inform you that owing to unforeseen obstacles, I was rendered unable to meet you at the railway station. I sent a very competent person with the same object in view. I likewise shall be deprived of the honor of an interview with you tomorrow morning by business in the Senate that does not admit of delay, and also that I may not intrude on your family circle while you meet with your son and brother. I shall have the honor of visiting you and paying you my respects at your lodgings not later than tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock precisely, and herewith I venture to present my earnest and, I may add, imperative request that Rodion Romanovich may not be present at our interview, as he offered me a gross and unprecedented affront on the occasion of my visit to him in his illness yesterday, and moreover, since I desire from you personally an indispensable and circumstantial explanation upon a certain point, in regard to which I wish to learn your own interpretation, I have the honor to inform you in anticipation that if, in spite of my request, I meet Rodion Romanovich, I shall be compelled to withdraw immediately, and then you have only yourself to blame. I write on the assumption that Rodion Romanovich, who appeared so ill at my visit, suddenly recovered 2 hours later, and so, being able to leave the house, may visit you also. I was confirmed in that belief by the testimony of my own eyes in the lodging of a drunken man who was run over and has since died, to whose daughter, a young woman of notorious behavior, he gave 25 rubles on the pretext of the funeral, which gravely surprised me, knowing the pains you went to raise that sum. Herewith, expressing my special respect to your estimable daughter, Avdotia Romanovna, I beg you to accept the respectful homage of your humble servant, P. Luzhin. What a waste of space, right? So he's saying, first of all, that he wants to meet with them, but if Rodion is there, he won't have it. And then he dishes some dirt, claiming that he saw their beloved Rodion give most of the money that he'd been given by his mother to a known prostitute. A nice little twist of the knife with that detail, huh? The two women aren't sure what to do, but feel like they want to discuss this with Rodion. So with that, they set off back to visit Raskolnikov, hopefully in a better state than he had been the night before. Oh, and by the way, have you noticed that with this three-name system, we have yet to hear Razumihin's first and patronymic name? Well, in this chapter, we finally got it. His full name is Dmitry Prokofyevich Razumihin. I'll probably stick to calling him Razumihin or Raz, though. But when they get to Rodion's flat, he is still pale-looking and somber, but he at least doesn't seem angry like he had been the night before. There was a very brief light in his eyes as his family walked in, but it faded quickly, leaving him in his state of anguish. The doctor hangs around just long enough to assure the women that the mood bursts are just parts of the symptoms of his illness and not an indication of his true state of mind. And Rodia, which remember, Rodia is the more affectionate version of Rodion that his mom wrote in the letter, so we haven't been using it for most of the book, but now that his mom's on the scene, we will start calling him Rodia from time to time. Anyway, Rodia gives a half apology to his mother, more just like an acknowledgement of her distress than him saying he's sorry. But then he grabs Dunya's hands and just smiles without saying anything. His mother lit up to see the improvement in her son. Razumihin seemed relieved and proud to show his friend acting like a decent human being again. And Rodia claims he had wanted to come visit them that morning, but he had needed Nastasia to wash the blood out of his clothes and he'd just gotten them back. At the mention of blood, he quickly had to explain to his now worried mother about what had happened the night before with Marmeladov. He even admits that he did an unpardonable thing as a result in giving away the rest of the hard-earned money she had sent to support him. He explains how it went to support the widow and her starving kids, but in the way we've come to expect from him in this book, he finishes the explanation by saying that he didn't have the right to do it. At one point, he makes a comment to his family about what a good man Razumihin is, and he sees how both his friend and his sister blush a little bit, giving him some signs of feelings between the two for each other. He smirks a bit at that realization, and they continue on with small talk for a while before they finally get to the real topic on everyone's mind, Mr. Luzhin. The women and Razumihin because of the letter, and Rodia because he still needed to hear his sister confirm that she understood his ultimatum. He is the first to broach the subject when he apologizes for his rudeness the previous night, but states that he does not withdraw his main argument, saying that he is a scoundrel and so is Luzhin, and there is only room for one scoundrel in the family. His mother is immediately sent into distress at this again, because keep in mind, she sees Luzhin as the financial salvation for her family. It's not just about if he's a noble person. Much like Ma Bennett from Pride and Prejudice, she is chiefly concerned with seeing her children set up for success in life. Dunya coolly steps in to explain her brother's one mistake. He had assumed she was marrying Luzhin as a sacrifice of herself for others, particularly Rodia. But she wants to be very clear, she is marrying this man for herself. She wants the security of an advantageous marriage to shield her from the hardships of life. No, there may not be love between them, but she knows how to keep him happy and thereby ensure her own security. Rodia, in his thoughts, is convinced that Dunya is still lying for his benefit, but she concludes saying she is marrying the man as a lesser of two evils, the other being poverty. Her brother can't help but laugh at this point, claiming that he has seen and talked to the man. There's no way for her to even respect him in a marriage, let alone love. He argues that she is selling herself for money. At this point, they reveal the letter sent by Luzhin where he demanded an audience without Rodion. And what struck me is what he's more upset by. It's not about the attempt to exclude him from the conversation, but it's that Luzhin misrepresented his act of charity, claiming that he'd given the money to a prostitute. He spends time arguing to his mother that he gave the money to the widow directly, who is only the stepmother to Sonia. It's very important to him that they understand this is a clear attempt on Luzhin's part to make them displeased with their son and brother. Ultimately, Dunya decides she wants him at the meeting. She then turns to Razumihin and says she would ask that he also be there. He accepts with a nod and a flush to his cheeks. And okay, this may seem like a random time to mention this topic, but I try to pace my narrative breaks, and there was just a gap that could benefit from one of my context explanations. So this is something that has been alluded to already several times and we will continue to see indirectly. It's just not tied to this specific scene. And it's basically just a brief primer on the ideas of the times, because when Fyodor Dostoevsky alludes to the modern ideas at several points in Crime and Punishment, he's pointing to a major shift that overtook Russia in the 1860s, one that his readers were living in their day-to-day lives. That shift is best summarized as rational atheism, which was a response to the Russian orthodoxy that had controlled the country for so long. And rational atheism was this belief that human reason, science, and social utility could replace God, tradition, and absolute moral law. And so this was changing because Western philosophies were starting to flood into Russia. Utilitarianism, materialism, scientific rationalism. And so the church, the czar, and inherited moral authority were increasingly viewed as outdated obstacles to progress. Morality itself was reframed as something calculable. If an action increased overall good, it could be justified, even if it violated old rules. Humans became problems to be optimized. And suddenly you can see how the plot of this story was tied to his concerns over the social state of his country. Because Dostoevsky didn't reject reason. He wasn't so bent on no, we just have to continue being Russian Orthodox. But what he was afraid of was reason without limits. The idea that if God is removed, morality becomes negotiable. And that if morality is negotiable, some people will decide they are exceptions. If suffering is dismissed as nothing but a temporary cost, all of a sudden violence becomes logical. Because at least in the beginning of the book, Raskolnikov wasn't mad. He's the logical endpoint of if some of these ideas were taken seriously. And these same beliefs hardened over decades into a revolutionary nihilism, where violence was justified for the future. An individual's life was reduced to expendable variables, basically the classic the ends justify the means argument. And this mindset eventually contributed to the forces that resulted in the Russian Revolution. Dostoevsky saw this coming, not politically, but maybe psychologically. And so when he alludes to these things in his books, he's expressing a concern for a culture that's beginning to believe that human reason alone could decide who may suffer or die. Crime and Punishment was in many ways his answer to say that logic may justify the act, but the soul still has to live with the outcome. Now, that last chapter may not have ended with someone new showing up, but the next chapter starts with someone showing up because the door to Rodian's room opened to reveal a visitor. So it's like Dostoevsky's keeping us on our toes of when he's going to introduce people. The entire room looked at the young lady curiously. Only Rodian recognized her. It was Sonia. But it took him a bit to realize who it was because he'd only seen her that one time the night before when she was dressed in her heavy makeup and flashy dress of being a prostitute. And here she was, without any makeup, in a very plain indoor dress, looking very humble, almost like a novice. She looked so much younger and more innocent. She also looked embarrassed to have shown up to a room full of people when she'd expected maybe a private conversation. She was very shy, and Raskolnikov was confused about her arrival. His mind raced at how this would look. He'd just defended to his mother and sister that Luzhin's claims of him giving money to a woman of notorious behavior were false, and here, said notorious woman had just walked into his room. Sonia seemed humiliated and moved as if to leave without saying anything more, but he stopped her and asked her to sit and join them. She came in, but was clearly uncomfortable in the presence of two ladies of higher caliber, because keep in mind, despite not being rich, the Raskolnikovs were a good family to the point that Rodian had been studying law. This almost seems like a sweet spot for authors, writing about families and characters who have the right stuff to be rich and powerful, but find themselves in less favorable circumstances. Anyway, Sonia is clearly uncomfortable and blurts out why she has come. It's to invite him, at her stepmother's request, to her father's funeral. She had been instructed to beg him to be there. He asked her to stay a couple minutes longer. He had hoped to talk with her. He then introduced her to his family, not by the title of notorious woman, but her more human position as the daughter of the man who had been run over the night before. His mother's face tightened into a judgmental scowl of sorts when she realized who this was. Dunya was also gazing intently, but less in judgment, more in curiosity. Rodion asks her for details of what has transpired since he had left that night, and he learns that the funeral will be held the next day, and there will be a funeral lunch, which it's pretty clear that his 25 rubles is why there even is a luncheon being held, a choice that would make some criticize when there are children who need to be cared for, but I think this just shows how proud Katerina Ivanovna is that she has to keep up appearances of being higher class than her current state would suggest. Sonia seems to understand the implication and assures him that the lunch will be plain, the coffin will also be plain, the entire affair won't cost very much. He catches Sonia glancing at his flat and asks her what's so interesting. Her lip trembles as she confesses that it's now even more humbling that he gave them all that money, knowing how simply he himself lives. His mom and sister look at the young lady with more gentle consideration, seeing her true humility and gratitude for Rodion's sacrifice. And after a moment, mom and sister excuse themselves to go about their day. We follow them just long enough to hear how Dunya is concerned for her brother's health, and the mom is concerned about his spending time with a prostitute. But Dunya has a much better understanding of Sonia as a person and tells her mother that her concerns are nonsense. The fact that he didn't even recognize the girl when she first came up shows that he's not familiar with her. When the mother reminds her of how Luzhin had described her in the letter, Dunya flatly said that her fiancé is a contemptible slanderer, showing that even if she still is inclined to marry him, there is no hint of her actually liking the man. With them gone, Raskolnikov had wanted to talk to Sonia more, but a more pressing matter was on his mind after his mother left. He had been sweating bullets out of fear that his mother and sister would ask about the ring and watch that had been gifted to him, which he had pawned off. No telling the heartbreak they would feel if they knew he didn't have them any longer. So he gets Sonia's address, saying he will come and visit her as soon as possible to talk more, and then he and Raz set off to visit Porfiry Petrovich, the investigator in charge, who's also a distant relative to Razumihin, because he will best know how to claim the pledges that had been confiscated during the investigation. As the three young people stood at the gate to Rodion's house saying their goodbyes, none of them noticed the mysterious gentleman who was observing them. He seemed to perk up hearing the name Raskolnikov, but when the three parted, he didn't follow Rodion and Raz. He followed Sonia, who was so preoccupied that she failed to notice that she was being followed by the man. Described this way, quote, "He was a man about 50, rather tall and thickly set, with broad high shoulders which made him look as though he stooped a little. He wore good and fashionable clothes and looked a gentleman of position. He carried a handsome cane, which he tapped on the pavement at each step. He had a broad, rather pleasant face with high cheekbones and a fresh color not often seen in Petersburg. His eyes were blue and had a cold and thoughtful look. His lips were crimson. He was a remarkably well-preserved man and looked much younger than his years." Sonia only took notice of him when she was climbing the stairs to her room and noticed that he was coming up behind her. As she stood at her door fumbling for her keys, he smiled as he walked past to the next door, taking out his own key. He laughed and tipped his hat as he noted that the two of them were neighbors. He had just arrived the day before yesterday. Sonia was flushed and hurried into her room without saying a word. Cutting back to Raskolnikov and Razumihin, as the two men walked to where Porfiry was expected to be, Raskolnikov's heart beat. Would this investigator already know who he was? Would he know about the little incident returning to the scene of the crime the previous night? There was only one way to find out. He may be walking to his ruin. He put off his feelings of fear by teasing his friend about the obvious crush he had on his sister. Raz denies it, but can't help but smile and blush thinking of Dunya. He was still teasing his friend as they arrived at the house, exactly as he'd hoped. He'd wanted whoever was inside to hear the laughter and easy-natured conversation from them as they approached. As they walked through the doorway, Raskolnikov was trying to hold in laughter, or at least was trying to look like he was trying to hold in laughter. It was a very calculated effort to come across as guilt-free and unbothered as possible. His eyes immediately locked on the man standing in the middle of the room. He'd even gone to lengths to try to act serious long enough to introduce himself before looking at his friend again and bursting once more into chuckles. Surely this impression would not be of a man capable of double homicide. Porfiry Petrovich smiled at the exuberance of youth and allowed them to have their fun before turning to matters. Rodion was off-put when he saw Zamyatov, the clerk, who he'd basically confessed to, sitting in the corner. He was not prepared for this. Rodion shook the investigator's hand as he apologized for Razumihin's sour mood, innocently claiming that all he had done was compare him to Romeo. pig, was all his friend could say through an angry chuckle. Porfiry laughed, saying it seems there is grounds for the comparison based on the reaction. Razumihin is quick to explain that Rodion here had wanted to meet Porfiry to discuss some business regarding pledges from the murdered pawnbroker. Porfiry Petrovich is described this way. Clean-shaven, he was wearing a dressing gown with very clean linen. He was a man of about 35, short, stout, even to corpulence, and clean-shaven. He wore his hair cut short and had a large round head, particularly prominent at the back. His soft, round, rather snub-nosed face was a sickly yellowish color, but had a vigorous and rather ironical expression. It would have been good-natured except for a look in his eyes, which shone with a watery, mawkish light under almost white, blinking eyelashes. The expression of those eyes was strangely out of keeping with his somewhat womanish figure and gave it... Okay, that's nothing more is helping here. 35, short, big head. That's what you need to know to come up with your own picture of who he is. Rodion explains about his pledges that were in possession of the murdered woman, talking as distantly as possible as if he was shocked to learn about the murder just recently. Porfiry explains that to secure the items, all he needs to do is write a letter explaining which items are his, and he can claim them once he has the money to redeem them. On an ordinary piece of paper, Raskolnikov interjected. Oh, the most ordinary, Porfiry said with a wry smile. He almost winked at him as he spoke, and in a flash, Raskolnikov's mind made an assumption. He knows, he thought. There were several more pages of trivialities that mostly goes to show how Raskolnikov is locked into constant guessing games with Porfiry about if he is suspected or not. He's immediately uneasy around the man. And it doesn't help that while his friend is trying to help Raskolnikov, everything Razumihin says is like a slightly incriminating comment. Like when he was explaining the sentimental value of the items he needed to reclaim, and Razumihin interjects that, oh, that's why you were so shaken when Zosimov said they were investigating everyone who had pledges. His friend was trying to remove suspicion off of Rodion in front of his relative Porfiry, but in the mind of Raskolnikov, Razumihin was only piling on the reasons for the investigator to be suspicious. Porfiry notes that he already knew of Raskolnikov's pledges, and he had intended to come to him eventually. The pledges were all wrapped in paper with the names and addresses of the pawner, so Raskolnikov says he would have come sooner, only he'd been ill. Oh yes, I heard about that, Porfiry said with a knowing, almost condescending tone. You were apparently in a great distress about something. Even now you look pale. Rodion asserted that he was quite well now, and Razumihin, again trying to help his friend but doing it in the most condemning way possible, mentions how Rodion is doing so much better that he gave them the slip the last evening, disappearing out on the town. Rodion nervously laughs, saying he just needed a break from all the attention. Porfiry mentions that Captain Fomich had also mentioned seeing Rodion on a staircase in the house of the recently deceased Marmeladov. And at this point, Raskolnikov tries to disengage, saying he has what he needs, they must be boring the policeman with their chat. But Razumihin asks for tea, saying his throat is dry. Porfiry says that is a capital idea. Hearing that the policeman had been discussing his whereabouts made him anxious. He must already be on some suspect list to even be of consequence. He knew Porfiry was toying with him, and it made him angry. Don't play with me like a cat and a mouse, he thought angrily. He has to convince himself that they have no proof, no facts. Even if they suspect him, they can't convict him of anything. And Porfiry then transitions to a topic that for a moment gives Rodion relief. He recalls Razumihin's party from the previous night and says that one of the more lively conversations got onto an interesting topic, the question of if there even is such a thing as crime. And Razumihin remembers it and now says that he'd wished in that moment his friend Rodion was there because he wanted to know Raskolnikov's thoughts on the matter. It started with talking about the socialist doctrine, specifically the part that claims that crime is just a protest against the wrongs of a given social organization and nothing more. See, here we are getting more allusions to the rational atheism that Dostoevsky was talking about as such a prominent ideology back then. Raz continues saying that the claimings of his guests were that if the societal organizations were rectified, crime would cease to happen because there wouldn't be need for it. And that such people don't like history because they don't think there's anything to learn from it. The future is about a new society that is basically mathematically organized to produce the true order. That's why they so dislike the living process of life. They don't want a living soul. The living soul demands life. The soul won't obey the rules of mechanics. The soul is object of suspicion. Imagine them thinking they can contain the whole secret of life in 2 pages of print. Porfiry laughed at the impassioned protest of his relative before using it as a way to get to the point that he wanted to bring up in the first place. This talk of crime reminds me of an article of yours, which interested me at the time. I believe it was called On Crime. I read it a couple months ago in the Periodical Review. My article? Raskolnikov choked on his tea. He had indeed written an article, but he was not aware of it having been published in the Periodical Review. He had submitted it 6 months ago when he left school to the Weekly Review. But Porphyry says that it made its way to the Periodical Review only a couple months ago and joked that the poor lad should reach out to them for payment for his work. Razumihin was proud of his friend for the accomplishment, but Raskolnikov knows why the investigator is bringing it up. It's not to applaud his writing. It's to discuss the idea he defended in that very article. How did you know the article was mine? He asked. I only signed it with my initials. Porphyry says that he had been so interested in it that he had spoken to the editor directly, who was a friend of his. Trying to act like it was a distant memory, Rodion says he believes he had used the article to analyze the psychology of a criminal before and after the crime. Yes, and you maintained that the perpetration of a crime is always accompanied by illness. Can you, as the listener, feel Rodion's chest tightening as he hears this? Because I could. But that is not the part of this that interests me most. Porphyry continued expressing his regret that the part that intrigued him the most had not been fully fleshed out by Raskolnikov like he had hoped. It was a suggestion that there were two types of people, and that one type of person was entitled to commit breaches of morality and crimes, and that the law is not for them. Raskolnikov smiled a little at the gross exaggeration, at least in his mind, of how his idea was being portrayed. Razumihin was confused, so Porphyry continued. In his article, all men are divided into ordinary and extraordinary men. Ordinary men have to live in submission, have no right to transgress the law because, don't you see, they are ordinary. But extraordinary men have a right to commit any crime and to transgress the law in any way just because they are extraordinary. That was your idea, if I'm not mistaken. Razumihin is in disbelief, but Rodion smiled again, seeing the game the investigator was playing, and decided to engage him in his battle of wits. That's not exactly what I was arguing, he began. You almost stated it, as I contended. The only difference from how you put it is I don't argue that extraordinary people are bound to commit breaches of morals, as you called them. I doubt such an argument would have gotten published. I only said that the extraordinary man has the right, not in the eyes of the law, but an inner right determined by himself to overstep certain obstacles in pursuit of an idea that may have greater benefit for the whole of humanity. He brings up the names of revered scientists like Isaac Newton as an example, saying, for example, if the discoveries that the world benefits from Newton's mind could not have happened without the losses of a man's life, or for the sake of argument, dozens, if not hundreds of lives, the value that Newton has provided the world would not only entitle him to take those lives, but would leave him duty-bound to do so because of the millions of lives that have been improved due to his discoveries. This is very basic utilitarianism that we're talking about right now. But, Raskolnikov clarifies, that doesn't mean Newton, even with his mind, would have been entitled to just murder people in the street or to steal from the market. He brings up ancient revolutionaries and leaders, specifically naming Napoleon, as examples of men who were, according to the laws of their time and place, criminals. They transgressed sacred codes, including bloodshed, in order to achieve their causes. He argues that most men of history could not have achieved what they did without transgressing some moral code or another, making them all criminals when it comes to the letter of the law. And wrapping that up, he reiterates that he doesn't have a clear mathematical or psychological way to divide ordinary men from extraordinary. He was simply explaining something he saw as a commonality in all the great achievers of history. He further pedestalizes those extraordinary ones, saying, for the most part, they seek in varied ways the destruction of the present for the sake of the better future, and that in doing so, they must be willing to step over a corpse or wade through blood. The ordinary man is the man of the present. The extraordinary man is the man of the future. While the first preserve the world as it is, the second move the world towards the vision for what it could be. Porphyry is enraptured. We can assume less in the sense of agreeing with this idea, but more with how passionately Raskolnikov presented his theory. They discuss how many such men are executed, and of the few that end up triumphant in their lifetime, many of them become the executioners. If it's necessary, Raskolnikov conceded, but he dives into one more detail that he feels is important to discuss. He says that most people are ordinary. They follow rules, they obey, they live inside the moral lines they are given. But some of them like to pretend they're not. They imagine themselves as radicals, as destroyers of the old world, as people ahead of their time, and they believe it sincerely. They talk like rebels, they think like rebels, but they never actually go very far. Because when it comes time to really cross the line, they can't live with it. They feel guilty, they shame themselves, they punish each other, they perform public acts of repentance just to prove they're still good people. So even when they flirt with dangerous ideas, they end up enforcing the system they claim to oppose. The truly new people, the ones who actually rewrite the rules, usually pass unnoticed or get written off as reactionary or ridiculous. That's why Raskolnikov says there's nothing to worry about. Most people don't need to be stopped. They stop themselves. And that's the quiet irony that, in my mind, Dostoevsky is pointing out. Most people can imagine being above morality, but very few can survive acting like it. In a slightly mocking tone, Porfiry asked if there were many of these truly extraordinary types, and with a defiant smile in return, Rodion says there are not many, stating that it takes a combination of being an extraordinary man as well as a true genius to actually be a revolutionary. He supposes maybe one in many thousands of millions, which, if you're doing the math, yes, that does just mean one in billions, but apparently that phrase was actually a phrase of its time to just suggest the rareness of something. Razumihin is shaken by this whole conversation. He had never known this part of his friend's mind, and the idea of any man being sanctioned to bloodshed merely by his own conscience is disturbing to him. Porfiry agreed. You've put my mind at ease about the number of truly extraordinary men, but what about some young man who sees himself as one of these great ones, as you call him, but early in his path he needs to remove some obstacles on his way to greatness? You see what I'm getting at. Raskolnikov doesn't back down from the obvious hint at suspicion and says he imagines such cases must happen, but that's the nature of life. Acknowledging that some will act in the name of being extraordinary while not truly being so is going to happen whether we acknowledge this theory or not. And what if such a hopeful extraordinary is caught? Porfiry asks. Then he deserves the punishment he gets, Raskolnikov returns. Well, you certainly are logical, the investigator said, but what of his conscience? After a brief pause, Rodion answered, if he has a conscience, he will suffer for his mistake. That will be his punishment, as well as prison. But what about the truly great men? Razumihin asked. If they kill, shouldn't they suffer for the blood they have shed? Raskolnikov scoffs as if this should be obvious. Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart, he says. The really great men must, I think, have great sadness on earth. In other words, you cannot be great if you're not willing to suffer for the pain you not only experience but cause in others. Porfiry acts almost bashful as he asks the next question. While you wrote your article, did you ever fancy yourself as an extraordinary man? Possibly, Raskolnikov said contemptuously. His friend was even more shocked, but Porfiry continued. If so, did you consider yourself capable of, how did you put it, overstepping obstacles, for instance, to rob and murder? He winked as he finished the sentence. Raskolnikov once again stood his ground. If I did, I certainly should not tell you, he said, as confidently as he could. But in his mind, he was outraged at how thinly veiled the accusations were coming in without actually accusing him of anything. It set his nerves on edge. Zamyatov spoke up from the corner for the first time in this whole conversation, saying maybe it was one of these future Napoleons who offed the pawnbroker. There was a pause before Rodion stood to go. The investigator acted surprised that he wanted to leave, but reminds him to write the note claiming his pledges if he wants to secure they'll be left for him to collect. He expresses that he would like to discuss Rodion's interactions with the pawnbroker sometime in detail, hoping he might provide them with some valuable insight. And then he asks one quick question that he tried to ask so casually as to catch Raskolnikov off guard. When you went upstairs, it was past 7, wasn't it? Yes, Rodion said before realizing what he was admitting to. He should have denied the timeline. But when you went upstairs between 7 and 8, did you see the painters on the second floor? Rodion tried to pretend he was racking his brain for memory while he was actually desperate to avoid the trap Porfiry had set for him. Then it came to him. He denied having seen any painters, but remembered having seen movers emptying the other fourth-floor apartment across from the pawnbroker. He couldn't backtrack on what time his visit was, but he had successfully avoided placing himself in the building the day of the murder by claiming that his visit at 7 o'clock was actually days earlier when he'd been there and seen the German being moved out of the apartment next door. Porfiry acted like he'd been mistaken all along and begs forgiveness for the error. Razumihin seemed angry at the investigator for being so clumsy with important and potentially prison-inducing details, and with that, Porfiry said goodbye and led them to the front door. As they walked, Razumihin was fuming at how the police officer had just tried to trap his friend. How dare they suspect him like that? To pick on a poor student who has been mentally fragile as of late due to illness. Raskolnikov was relieved to be out, but was also irritated because in order to avoid further suspicion in the moment, he had just agreed to stop by the station for a formal cross-examination where Porfiry would have another chance to try and trap him. He was feeling light in that moment, though, as a man who had received a stay of execution for at least one more day. He parted ways with Razumihin and went home. That feeling of relief didn't last long. By the time he reached his room, he was covered in sweat, and the first thing he did was go back to the hole where he'd stashed the stolen goods briefly and confirm that he hadn't left even a single cufflink behind. He went back downstairs to head over to see his mother and sister, but as he exited the house, he heard the porter out in the yard say, "Here he is himself." He looked up to see the porter talking to a short man who was dressed like an artisan. Raskolnikov walked over asking what was going on, but after a long and suspicious glance at Rodion, the strange man left without a word. As you can imagine, this made Rodion very uneasy, and he asked the porter what was going on. The porter said that this man had just asked if a student by the name of Raskolnikov lived here, and it was that very moment when Rodion had come outside. So he took off after the stranger. There was a decent amount of distance between them already, but he walked quickly to gain ground. He didn't want to call out to the man, but just kept walking until they were side by side. The man noticed him, gave him one more glance before looking down in front of him and marching even faster. "Why were you asking the porter about me?" he asked. The man said nothing. He didn't even look up. "What is your name? You inquire about me but won't speak to me?" The man looked up at him this time with a dark glare and sneered a single word out at him. "Murderer." They both kept walking. Although Raskolnikov's legs felt like jelly now. He couldn't speak for a moment, but finally regained himself enough to ask, "What do you mean? Who is a murderer?" "You are a murderer," the man said with a hateful smile. He could see how panic-stricken Raskolnikov was at this. Rodion stopped, but the man kept walking. Within a few moments, he was gone, leaving Raskolnikov standing in the street, his mind on fire, his body feeling weak again. He dragged himself back to his garret and laid down, the despair and fury setting in on him. All he could think of was that sentence that played over and over again from the man he didn't know. "You are a murderer." Whew, and that is where we're going to leave things for today, guys. If you didn't notice when you clicked on the episode, this is a part one. At this pace, this episode is going to be the longest I've ever done, but I've just decided to start doing these in 2 parts because it's so much in one single episode. So even though we're not done with the story, I do have a lesson because I can't have an episode without a lesson. But before we get to the lesson, I just want to express my delight as the reader when out of nowhere, after we're already kind of settled into the direction of the story and we think we know how things are going, we learn about Rodion's academic paper where we learn that these ideas of his to kill someone to take their money, to live a great life, didn't originate in that tavern where he overheard the student and the officer discuss the old hag like we've been thinking this whole time. He has had these thoughts for a long time, and taking the pawnbroker's life was just like his own attempt to prove that he was an extraordinary man. It was such a fascinating discovery to learn at this stage of the story. It adds an entirely new layer of depth to this character, because how do we judge him differently when we learn that his choices in the past few weeks were not a response to him living in hard times, but as a result of a more fundamental worldview that he had been holding on to even before he had had to drop out of school. It's so good. Dostoevsky is a genius, and that last-minute insight before the episode break sets us up perfectly to examine something about Rodion that is the basis for the lesson in this episode. But before that, if you haven't given the show 5 stars already, if you haven't subscribed, if you haven't given this a thumbs up, whatever metrics on the platform you're listening to, consider doing that. Helps grow the show, and it lets me know that you're out there. I appreciate it. So to set up the story, I want to ask you, have you ever heard of Potemkin's village? I swear I didn't bring this up because it's another Russian idea. They're not from anywhere near the same timeline. And the truth is, the story I'm about to tell you is not even confirmed as reality. A lot of people think it was made up. But the idea of the Potemkin village has cemented itself regardless of how true the story is. Basically, the idea of the Potemkin village, whether it's true or not, is that Grigory Potemkin, who was some person in Catherine's government, I don't know what his position was, but that he was in charge of making sure that newly captured parts of the country were thriving, and that she would tour some of these parts of the country. And in an effort to make things look better than they were, he constructed facades for buildings that looked nice, but they were literally just facades. If you had walked through a single door, you would have seen how run down and terrible they looked. And the story, as I've heard it, even goes on to say that he would build the facade on one town and then tear it down and move it to the next village and build it up as Catherine was passing through. So again, the story doesn't really matter. The idea of the Potemkin village is just this idea of something looking good on the outside and being rotten on the inside. So I set that up because my lesson is what I'm calling the Potemkin man. I could have said Potemkin person and it's got alliteration for it, but I think it's just that you have such a stronger visualization when I say Potemkin man. So I'm going with that, even though it can be either gender. And the Potemkin man is the same idea of a Potemkin village, except it may not be so much an external thing as it is internal. A Potemkin man is someone who looks extraordinary on the surface, but collapses 1 inch beneath it. Not because he's evil, not because he's stupid, but because he's trying to be seen as something that he hasn't paid the price to become. And the reason this type of person is everywhere across morality, philosophy, fitness, finance, spirituality is simple. It's that we have a desire to be great before we have the capacity to be great. And that gap can feel unbearable. So we fill it with stories. We learn just enough about what it takes to be great in a certain area to cosplay it. We pick up the language, the aesthetics, the posture, the quotes, the labels, things like stoic or high agency or extraordinary. But underneath, nothing fundamental has changed. One of my favorite examples of this is the man who claims to be stoic and probably only learned about Marcus Aurelius because of Ryan Holiday, who then loses his mind when Ryan Holiday says something that is politically inconvenient for him. The man who claims to be stoic but then loses his head in a comment section because you disagree with an opinion, that stoicism is not surviving contact with reality. And that's why I think we can basically position the Potemkin man as an NPC that's masquerading as a protagonist. They're low agency dressed up as high agency. Because real agency is responsibility heavy. It takes on a lot more effort. Potemkin agency is permission based. You're borrowing the permission to be this thing from an ideology, from a group, from an aesthetic, but you take those things away and all of a sudden the Potemkin man panics. True greatness works in the opposite direction. It doesn't ask for permission. It accepts the burden required to become that thing. Whereas the Potemkin man is concerned with acquiring all the signals that he is the thing and then asks you to not look any deeper, the true protagonist spends more time accepting the burden of what it takes to really become that thing. It starts with the mirror, not the costume. And this is exactly where Raskolnikov comes in. He wants to believe that he belongs to a rare class of men, the extraordinary, men who can step outside moral law because their vision is so important that normal rules don't apply. But look at what happens after he acts. He doesn't stride forward, he doesn't become freer, and he doesn't grow clearer. He disintegrates. He has mood swings. He's physically sick. He's compulsively feeling guilt. He has moments of sudden arrogance followed by collapse. He oscillates wildly between pride and self-loathing because his internal reality does not match the identity he's trying to inhabit. That is the tell. A truly extraordinary man wouldn't be undone by the weight of his own self-image. A Potemkin man is crushed by it. Raskolnikov isn't extraordinary or purely ordinary. He's something worse. He's that thing that he said in the middle, the ordinary man who believes he's extraordinary but can't survive acting like it. And Dostoevsky's insight is brutal here. Most people don't need an external investigation from a police officer to crumble. Their own conscience handles that. They self-flagellate, they self-expose, and they self-destruct. which means the danger isn't that too many people will become extraordinary. The danger is that too many people will pretend that they already are. And that's why no one becomes a true protagonist without first accepting reality. Because true heroism, while requiring self-belief, doesn't require projection of your worth. It begins with self-submission. You stare into the mirror and say, this is who I am, this is where I'm weak, this is what I don't yet have. And then, and only then, you begin to put in the long, humiliating work of becoming. You skip the costume, the shortcuts, hiding behind ideologies of people you don't really understand. A hero doesn't waste energy being something he's not. A hero doesn't try to skip the steps of becoming. He spends it learning how to be something real. Raskolnikov, by his own definition, fits into his third category of person, the ordinary who likes to masquerade as extraordinary, the Potemkin man. And we will see so much more of this behavior in part 2 next week. So I'm glad you get to hear this now so you can keep an eye out for when he does this sort of thing in the second half. That does it for this episode. Come back next week for part 2. Many of the questions will be answered about the fate of Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. I'm Jameson Olson. This has been a very exhilarating part 1. Can't wait to dive more into part 2. We'll see you next time.